Eddard Stark knelt in the cramped darkness, his wrists bound, skin raw from the iron shackles. The chill of the Red Keep's dungeons licked at his bones. The torchlight flickered on the damp stone walls, illuminating the shape of a weary man who had been Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and once the King's Hand. He'd been told his life was forfeit. The rumors spread throughout King's Landing that he would die at dawn in front of a baying crowd. Yet hours from that grim appointment, there was a faint shuffle at the threshold of his cell. He could barely muster the strength to look up, but when he did, he beheld a figure swathed in shadow, a whisper where the torchlight could not quite reach. Eddard knew that shape. Even in near darkness, Varys the Spider possessed a unique stillness, a careful hush born of a lifetime of courtly intrigues. "My Lord Stark," came the soft, lilting voice that had once warned him of the perils at court. "I feared I might not reach you in time." Ned tried to speak, but his throat felt rough as sand. The numbness in his arms crept up to his shoulders. For days now, he had endured the frigid hold of these dungeons, holding on to a feeble hope that maybe, just maybe, he could spare his daughter Sansa by some last show of contrition in the Great September. He told untruths against his own honor for her sake, uttering them in front of the conspiratorial courtiers. And for what? One final mercy from the boy King Joffrey? He almost laughed at the futility. Yet Varys's presence, ghostly and sudden, stirred him anew. Eddard formed the question on his lips. "Why are you here?" Varys came closer, pressing a fingernail into the lock with remarkable deftness. "I have come to offer the smallest window of escape," he said softly. "A city is a labyrinth of corridors, secret passages, and illusions. I know them all. Cannot watch you die, Ned Stark. If not for you, then for the realm." His voice trembled at the end, betraying the usual measured calm. "Though if you linger, there will be no tomorrow. Come now, quickly." Blinking in disbelief, Ned felt the man's thin fingers manipulate the iron padlock. Within heartbeats, the shackles fell away, leaving Ned's wrists trembling in sudden, wild freedom. The receding metal clank felt both exhilarating and terrifying. This was treason of the highest order. But Eddard Stark was a man whose life lay in tatters. He could no longer trust in the illusions of justice or honor from the throne. The only justice was to slip from the jaws of the Lannisters, find a way to protect his daughters, and do what he must in the shadows. He thought once more of his family. Sansa, Arya, Robb, Bran, Rickon, even Jon so far away, and the desire for vengeance warmed him like a roaring hearth in a winter storm. He rose unsteadily and almost collapsed into Varys, who braced him. "Wait," Ned rasped. "Arya, where is Arya?" "She vanished the day they took you," Varys said in a hush. "Some say Yoren of the Night's Watch found her and whisked her away. There have been sightings of a fierce young girl in tattered breeches. She has the wolf's look in her eyes, they say. You need not fear for her tonight, my lord." Relief and sorrow warred in Ned's chest. He pictured Arya lost somewhere on the roads, but alive with the resilience of youth. A prayer to the old gods formed in his heart. Then he took a trembling step. "We must go. Lead the way." Varys guided him through corridors Ned did not recognize. He limped, letting the spider bear much of his weight. The dungeons gave way to winding stairs, small courtyards in the bowels of the Red Keep, even past deserted kitchens. They heard a guard's distant laughter, so they stepped behind a cask of rancid flour. With the hush of conspirators, they pressed onward. Eventually, they climbed into the night air. Ned tasted freedom like a crisp wind off the moors. In the distance, the flicker of torchlight from the White Sword Tower glowed faintly. No shouts of alarm, no footsteps in mad pursuit yet. "This way," said Varys, sounding a bit breathless. The path led around the outer walls where a short drop landed on a neglected rooftop. From there they scrambled and stumbled in the darkness. Occasionally, the muffled noise of their passage caused Ned's heart to leap, but they pressed on, forging deeper into the labyrinth of King's Landing's rooftops and hidden alleyways. At last, they descended to a narrow walkway leading behind a row of potshops and beggars' huts. Varys halted by a simple door, which by all appearances led to a disused storeroom. When the spider opened it, Ned saw a lamp dimly lit within. "Go," whispered Varys. "Change into these clothes. There is a man inside who will guide you." I have arranged for certain distractions this night. You must vanish, Lord Stark. Truly vanish. Ned hovered at the threshold, eyes adjusting to the gloom. He clenched his fists. What about Sansa? Varys's expression was a mask of sadness. I cannot act rashly. The Lannisters keep her in the Red Keep. My little birds say she dines with the Queen. You know I tried to protect her, to shield her from the worst of Joffrey's cruelty. But I cannot pry the lion's jaws open by force. Anger rose hot in Ned. He pictured Joffrey, that cruel, mocking smile that turned the boy's face into something monstrous. Sansa was his daughter, bound to that throne of daggers. Yet Ned was powerless to free her now. He swallowed his fury. He would not forget this debt or the vow of vengeance blossoming in his soul. Perhaps if he survived, found some cunning route, he might protect Sansa from afar. Be safe, Lord Stark, said Varys. The next steps will not be easy. But if you fail, the realm will lose you forever. Before Ned could thank him, the spider melted back into the night. Perhaps that was Varys's nature, a savior in one moment, a manipulator the next, and always a puzzle. It mattered little now. Ned slipped inside the storeroom. A single candle revealed a ragged man wearing a hooded cloak. Quickly, the stranger said, dress. We leave as soon as you're ready. Wincing at his bruises, Ned stripped off his ragged prison clothes. He donned scratchy wool breeches, a coarse linen shirt, and a long traveler's cloak with a deep hood that concealed most of his face. The garments smelled of dust and tallow, but the fit was functional. The man beckoned him through a back door that opened onto an alley so narrow that only a thread of moonlight reached the ground. They crept along, hearts pounding. A couple of gaunt dogs snarled at them from a refuse pile, but the stranger made a small gesture, and the animals slunk away. They pressed onward, weaving through the city's slumbering underbelly. Occasionally, Ned glimpsed shadowed figures peering from doorways or windows. The night seemed alive with watchers. Every step felt like a reckoning. Eventually, they reached the river gate, a place typically swarming with gold cloaks and watchmen. But here no one stood guard. The stranger led Ned along the waterside, where a small boat bobbed in the black waters of the Blackwater Rush. One faint lantern glowed from the prow. The ferryman, or whomever he was, offered no greeting. He simply lifted his lantern in acknowledgement and waited. Ned's guide gestured. Get in. Be silent. Eddard stepped gingerly into the boat, and the stranger followed. With unspoken haste, the ferryman set the oars to the water. A hush descended. Ned gazed at the receding shape of the city walls. The Red Keep perched on Aegon's high hill, torches glowing along the battlements, oblivious to his escape. The fortress seemed to brood in its own majesty, a seat of power that had twisted and broken men for generations. He whispered a silent oath to the old gods. Let him find a way back one day to see justice done. He yearned to rescue Sansa and punish those who destroyed his life, but he knew that to strike swiftly now would mean death. They glided downriver, drifting farther from the city's glow. The black sky stretched above like a great, empty sea. The chill in the air made him clench his jaw. Eventually, the ferryman guided them to a small pier near the edge of a muddy bank. Ned and his guide disembarked, the boat rocking behind them. The ferryman gave them a final glance and rowed off, disappearing into the darkness. With few words, the hooded stranger led Ned to a waiting cart. A donkey stood harnessed to it, dozing. Ned climbed onto the cart's rough wooden bench, and the stranger flicked the reins. The donkey roused, trudging forward at a laborious pace. They followed a narrow road that snaked away from the Blackwater. King's Landing's lights grew distant behind them, a haze on the horizon. Still, Ned's mind raced. He was free, but what came next? Would he flee to White Harbor in the north? Would he join Robb's army? Should they muster to face the Lannisters in open war? But war would place his sons at risk and threaten Sansa's life if captured. Then another, darker notion called to him. He recalled the words of Varys, "You must vanish." And vanish truly, not as Lord Eddard Stark, but as someone unknown. A rumor of how many men had once left for Braavos, for Old Town, for Pentos, never to return. And there was that half-remembered story of the Faceless Men, an order of assassins hailing from the free city of Braavos who could shift faces and slip through the cracks of the world. It was a rumor Arya once spoke of in hushed excitement, or maybe he'd overheard her chatter with the Bravosi dancing master, Sirio Farrell. The girl had always possessed a knack for the dangerous and the strange. If Ned truly wanted vengeance, if he wanted to strike at the Lannisters without dooming his family, he would need cunning that his old self had never mustered. Honor had guided him his entire life, but now that path had led him to betrayal and near death. In the darkness, he considered an unthinkable path. If he could slay the boy King Joffrey and the queen who manipulated him, if he could avenge the betrayal that had destroyed his family's peace, then perhaps he needed to become as elusive as the spider himself. Or more so, become no one. The idea festered, both horrifying and strangely compelling. The hooded man broke the silence with a low murmur. "We ride until dawn. After that, you'll be on your own." Ned looked at him. "You've risked much to bring me this far. Varys paid me with gold and threats. But I don't want any trouble. I'll drop you near the Rosby Road. From there, do as you will." Ned nodded, pulling his hood tighter. "Thank you," he said simply. The man offered no reply. They traveled that way for hours, passing a few scattered huts where lanterns glimmered. Roosters crowed occasionally, though the night still clung to the land. Ned resisted the urge to look behind him, expecting at any moment the thundering hooves of Lannister outriders or the flash of a torch-bearing patrol. But the night remained silent, the only sound the crunch of wheels over gravel and the donkey's soft grunts. By the time the moon sank and the sky began to lighten, they had arrived at a fork in the road. The donkey halted. The man guided Ned off the cart, pointed wordlessly to the southern branch, and turned his cart north without so much as a farewell. Ned stood in the pale dawn, alone. A crow cawed in the distance. The forest thickened to the east, while to the west the land sloped gently toward farmland. He pulled his cloak close, forced his legs to move, and started walking south on the road. The dust rose beneath his boots as he set his mind to a single purpose. If the Faceless men truly existed, if their fabled House of Black and White offered sanctuary to those seeking to become no one, then he must find them. He recalled that Braavos was set upon a lagoon in the far north of Essos, a city that thrived on trade and secrets. It was possible that the one place the Lannisters would never think to look for Eddard Stark would be among the deadliest killers in the known world. Daylight found him weary and faint with hunger, but he pressed on. He paused at a shallow creek to drink, the cool water easing his dry throat. He ate a bit of hard bread he found in the cloak's pocket. Varys must have provided it. Then he continued. With each step, the memory of his near execution sank deeper, fueling his resolve. He would not remain prey. He could not hope to lead an army, nor rely on the tenuous alliances of the realm's lords. But if he could vanish, if he could harness the darkness, then perhaps one day he could slip a blade into the heart of those who threatened his house. He traveled through a landscape that changed slowly from farmland to scattered hamlets. Each time he approached a settlement, he tugged the hood lower and tried to hide the limp in his gait. His hair and beard were scruffy, and his face bore the pallor of a man half dead. Folks took him for a common traveler or a beggar. None recognized the once proud warden of the north. There was no place for honor now, no place for the proud bearing of a lord. Instead, he embraced the shadows, avoided questions, and pressed onward. When the sun grew high, Ned found a stable near a tavern. He had no coin except for a single golden dragon that Varys had slipped into his pocket. It might buy him a horse if he lied or bargained carefully. Yet trust was scarce. The stable master eyed him warily, but Ned told him a story of being a mercenary fallen on hard times who needed a small horse to reach his sick mother in Duskendale. The stable master hesitated, but, upon seeing the bright gold, nodded. Soon Ned mounted a shaggy mare and continued his southward journey with renewed speed. Days passed. He stuck to lesser roads, avoiding the main King's Road, suspecting the Lannisters might have set watchers. He asked no questions about the events in King's Landing, nor did he linger in any village. It was a lonely, silent flight. In his solitude, Ned's thoughts returned time and again to his children. Robb would rally the bannermen, no doubt furious about his father's captivity. Bran and Rickon would remain in Winterfell. Sansa, her fate weighed heaviest on him. He pictured her lonely in the Red Keep, forced to smile for Joffrey, forced to keep her tears hidden. And Arya, out there in the wide world. Perhaps she was safer than the rest of them. The memory pained him, yet also gave him a grim solace. At least she was free. One evening, under a blood-red sunset, he drew near Duskendale. Rumors said the port city could offer passage across the narrow sea. He found a place on the outskirts, a rundown inn with half the shingles missing, where he stabled his mare and took a modest room with the last of the gold dragon. That night, as he sipped watered-down ale and gnawed on stale bread, he overheard talk in the dimly lit common room. Tensions were rising, men said. The Lannisters were at odds with the Starks. Word had reached Duskendale that Lord Eddard Stark had been executed. Some swore they saw his head on a spike at the city gates of King's Landing. Others claimed it was a trick. The uncertainty stung Ned's heart. He realized that if rumor proclaimed him dead, so be it. That lie might keep him safe. He finished his meager meal and retired to his cramped room. Fear and longing coursed through him as he closed his eyes. Could he truly abandon the name of Stark? The notion horrified him. But this was the path he had chosen, a path that might lead him to Braavos and the hidden halls of the Faceless Men. If it was possible to join them, to learn their secrets, perhaps he could shed this broken shell of a lord and become an avenger in the night. At dawn, he left the inn before the other patrons stirred. Mounting his mare, he rode to Duskendale's wharf. The salt wind stung his nostrils and gulls cried overhead. He inquired discreetly after ships sailing east. Most were bound for Pentos, Mere, or Liss, but one small trading vessel named the Dancing Cloud was set to sail north by way of Cracklaw Point and onward across the sea to Braavos. Ned found the captain and offered him the last silver stags he had gleaned from pawning the stablemaster's donkey harness. The captain, a wiry man with a large scar on his cheek, rubbed his chin. He studied Ned's face intently as if searching for something unsaid. Ned offered no explanation beyond needing to reach Braavos for a business venture. Eventually, coins changed hands and the deal was struck. They set sail under a cloudy sky. As the shore of Westeros receded, Ned stood at the stern, cloak whipping in the briny wind, and felt a bittersweet pang in his heart. He was leaving his land, his people, his entire identity behind. The vow he swore rang silently in his mind. This was not a mere flight. This was a transformation. He was a dead man in the eyes of the realm. Whatever lay ahead might be darker yet, but also the only path he saw that led to the Lannisters' downfall. The voyage to Braavos was neither swift nor pleasant. The Dancing Cloud bobbed over rough seas and Ned's old war wounds ached in the damp chill. The sailors barely spoke to him. At night, he found a corner of the hold to curl up in, feeling every lurch of the ship in his bones. When he wasn't drifting into fitful sleep, he forced himself to conjure memories of his children. He recalled teaching Arya to hold a sword properly, seeing Bran climb the walls of Winterfell, hearing Sansa's voice as she sang ballads with her mother's sweet tone. He remembered the proud day that Robb first donned armor. He clung to these recollections like a drowning man clutching driftwood. No matter what transformations lay before him, he must keep the memory of his family alive in the corners of his mind. After nearly a fortnight at sea, the outlines of Braavos rose on the horizon. Sprawling across the lagoon, a forest of canals and islands, the Titan of Braavos loomed at the city's entrance, that giant sentinel carved from stone, towering in defiance over the waves. The approach was breathtaking in its grandeur, though the city was gray beneath overcast skies. Ned felt a trembling inside him as they steered beneath the Titan's great legs. Its stony visage seemed to look down upon them with ancient authority, as if measuring his worth before granting entry. Once they docked at a quieter pier away from the bustling purple harbor, Ned disembarked quietly. Braavos swarmed with activity, merchants, courtesans, Braavos with slender blades, and foreigners from the distant corners of the world. The swirl of languages and the tang of fish and spice in the air overwhelmed him at first. But he knew he had to move with purpose. The city's labyrinthine canals and alleyways were well known for swallowing strangers who came unprepared. He needed to find the House of Black and White, the rumored temple where the Faceless Men resided. Few knew its location, and fewer still would speak of it openly. Yet Ned recalled a rumor that the temple stood on a small island in the quiet lagoon, accessible only by boat. The best place to start might be among the boatmen who ferried people from one canal to the next. He wound his way through the city, mindful of the stares his Northman features occasionally drew. He was older than most travelers who sought Braavos for a fresh start, but his seriousness seemed to shield him from prying questions. Eventually, he found himself on a narrow quay where small boats for hire bobbed. A half-dozen men and women stood there, beckoning prospective customers. He approached an older boatman whose lined face suggested he'd been plying these canals for decades. "I seek the Isle of the Gods," Ned said quietly. That was the local name he'd heard whispered where the House of Black and White was SA. "ID to stand. Can you ferry me there?" The boatman gave him a long, shrewd look. He did not speak at first. Then he nodded, gesturing to his boat. I can take you. But know this, the house you seek is a place of finality. Not all who go there return." His Braavosi accent was thick. Ned gave a slight bow of thanks and stepped into the boat. The man untied the rope and took up the oar, pushing away from the quay. They drifted through the winding canals of Bravos, passing under arching bridges, past stately homes, and by clusters of battered tenements. Gondolas and larger trading barges shared the waterways, each with its own distinct smell and sound. The further they went, the quieter it became until they emerged onto a broad, tranquil expanse of water. In the near distance, Ned saw a small isle with a modest structure, a somber building of black and white marble. There were few boats moored nearby. The presence around it felt hushed, almost sacred. The boatman brought them to a stop at a wooden dock. "Here," he murmured. Ned placed a few Bravosi coins, the last of what he had, into the man's hand. The boatman raised a brow. "You would do better to keep this," he said, as if pitying him. "But if this is truly your wish—" Ned nodded. "It is." He stepped onto the dock and the old boatman rowed away in silence, leaving Ned alone with the softly lapping water at his feet and the imposing edifice ahead. The house of black and white rose before him, its doors carved half of blackwood, half of white weirwood, a subtle nod to something ancient and powerful. Ned felt a shiver. The white half of the door looked eerily reminiscent of the heart trees in the godwood of Winterfell, though it was shaped with a different craft. A hush pervaded the aisle, broken only by the distant cries of gulls. He stood at the threshold for a long moment, summoning the courage to knock. Could Eddard Stark truly walk this path? Was this not a betrayal of everything he once stood for: truth, honesty, open conflict over hidden knives? But he remembered the heads on spikes at the Red Keep, the betrayal that cost him his honor, the danger his daughters still faced. Honor had led him to the scaffold. A new way was needed. He placed his hand against the door, and it swung open at his touch. Inside, the gloom was cool and still, the silence profound. He stepped into a large hall lit by sparse torches set high on pillars. An eerie feeling crept over him, the presence of many gods. Statues lined the walls, representing deities from across the world: the father, the mother, the drowned god, the weeping lady of Lys, the lion of night, and others he did not recognize. At the center stood a still pool of black water. The air smelled faintly of incense and something else more subtle, a tang reminiscent of a tomb. He walked deeper into the hall, footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Then a voice spoke from behind a pillar. "Why do you come to the House of Black and White?" Ned's breath caught. A slender figure stepped forward, dressed in robes of black and white. A cowl hid the person's face. The voice was low, sexless, or perhaps it merely echoed strangely in the hall. Ned bowed his head. "I come seeking the Faceless men," he said. I wish to learn." "To learn what?" Ned took a steadying breath. "Your ways. How to become no one." The robed figure approached slowly. "Our ways are not for the faint of heart. Many come here seeking death for themselves or for others. Few find what they expect." Ned swallowed. "I have lost everything. My family, my home, my honor. I once believed in open truth, but I was betrayed. Now I live in the shadows. I would claim vengeance on those who wronged me and threatened my blood. But to do that, I must shed the name I once bore. I must become something else." A silence lingered. Finally, the figure nodded. "Vengeance is a fine reason, but we are the Faceless men. We serve the many-faced God. To become one of us, you must relinquish the you that you were. Are you prepared?" Ned closed his eyes, thinking of Sansa's face. The thirst for retribution burned in him like a hot coal. "I am." The figure beckoned. "Then come. You shall be fed and you shall rest. After that, your path begins. If you falter, you will be cast out or destroyed. This is no game." Ned followed, heart hammering. In a side chamber, he was given a simple meal of bread and broth. He ate in silence, aware of robed figures moving about in the corners of his vision. After he finished, he was shown to a small cell with a straw bed. The figure spoke one last warning. "When you awaken, remember that you are no one, or wish to be no one. We shall see if you speak truth." Alone in the darkness, Ned lay his head on the thin pillow. His mind whirled with doubt. He, a lord of Winterfell once, now in a strange temple, prepared to forsake his name? And yet his heart insisted that only through shadows could he strike at his enemies in the distant future. That night, he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep as if the very walls lulled him into oblivion. He awoke stiff and disoriented. A small brazier in the hallway cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside his door, a folded set of robes awaited him, black and white. He dressed, the cloth rough against his skin. He felt as though he were clothing himself in uncertainty. Then he emerged into the hall, greeted by another robed acolyte who silently gestured for him to follow. He was led to a courtyard open to the sky where a single twisted weirwood tree with bark of white and leaves of dark red loomed. Or perhaps it was not a true weirwood, merely carved to look like one. The leaves did not rustle in any breeze. They were stone, or so it seemed upon closer inspection. The courtyard was enclosed by tall walls, the faint gloom of the temple overshadowing everything. Another figure stood there, a man with a kindly face, or at least that was how he appeared at first glance. Yet there was a coolness in his gaze, an agelessness in his expression that belied any name. "You wish to learn our secrets," he said in a calm voice. "We teach only those who desire to serve the many-faced God. And to serve, you must abandon the self. A man cannot be both Eddard Stark and no one. Which do you choose?" Ned's pulse quickened. This man knew his true name. There was no point in denial. "I choose to be no one." "Then, to begin, you must unlearn what you have known. Cast aside the burdens of rank and honor. You must become a vessel. Are you prepared?" Ned met his eyes. He thought of Sansa, of Joffrey on the throne, of the betrayal in King's Landing. He clenched his jaw. "Yes, good." The man turned, walked to a stone bench near the tree, and gestured for Ned to sit. "We shall teach you the arts of deception, of blending in, of potions and illusions. We shall teach you how to slip a blade between the ribs without sound. But first we must teach you to let go of who you were. That is the hardest lesson of all." And so it began. Days bled into weeks. The House of Black and White had many ways to break a person of their old self. Ned was instructed to wash the bodies of the dead who came seeking the gift of the many-faced God. The quiet tasks forced him to face mortality up close. Some nights, he was forced to serve as a silent attendant in the hall of worship, watching the sorrowful or the desperate come to drink from the temple's pool, the water that granted a peaceful death. In those moments, he grappled with the finality of it all. Death was not a threat to be used, but a gift to be given. It was a strange, alien perspective. At other times, his teachers engaged him in subtle tests. They would place him in the streets of Bravos with instructions to gather information or perform small errands, all without revealing himself. He wore disguises, a beggar's rags, a merchant's vest, the patched tunic of a dock laborer. He learned to speak in a different accent, to slump his shoulders so he looked shorter, to feign injuries. It was a crash course in subterfuge for a man who had always prided himself on honesty. Yet honest Ned Stark had died in King's Landing. Now he must be no one, adopting roles as needed. He chafed at first, stumbling over lies, feeling shame at every deception. But he persevered, fueled by the memory of that boy king's sneer. If this was what it took to bring justice, so be it. The weeks grew into months. Each day brought a new lesson or a new trial. Ned learned the rudiments of poisons from a quiet woman with eyes like polished ebony. He learned the subtle craft of forging a new face, though he had not yet partaken in the actual ritual. They told him that would come later, once he had proven himself worthy. He practiced mimicry, adopting the posture and expressions of strangers in the city. He also honed his swordsmanship in secret corners of the temple, though the style taught here was different from the knightly training of Westeros, lighter, more reliant on speed and precision. In the hush of the nights, after his tasks were done, he would slip into a lonely corner of the courtyard and remember who he once was, just for a fleeting moment. He would picture Sansa's face, his family, Winterfell's great hall. It was a private ritual, a defiance of the temple's instruction to abandon his old self. Part of him worried he would lose his soul if he let go of his memories. Another part understood that this was the sacrifice demanded. And so the tension grew within him day by day as he advanced in the secrets of the Faceless men. He accompanied the kindly-faced man on minor assignments, watching as the man delivered the gift to those who asked for it. Sometimes it was gentle, a cup of wine laced with a sweet poison that brought quick release. Other times, a sharpened dagger slid between ribs, all without a sound. Ned's stomach churned at first, but he forced himself to endure. This was the way of the many-faced God. All men must die, Vala Morghulis. If death came as a mercy or as a punishment, that was not for him to decide, only to serve the will of those who prayed for it or paid for it. Yet he kept close the knowledge that eventually he would see the Lannisters pay in kind. One day, he was summoned to a small chamber deep in the temple, lit only by a single candle. The kindly-faced man stood there, along with the ebony-eyed woman. They regarded Ned, who wore simple black breeches and a white tunic. "A time has come for you to prove you can be no one," the man said. "We have a task for you." Ned forced himself to remain impassive. "What must I do?" The woman stepped forward. A certain merchant in the city has prayed for the death of another. We have accepted the contract. You will fulfill it under our watch. It is a test. If you fail, you shall be cast out, or worse. If you succeed, we shall consider your deeper initiation. Ned felt his pulse quicken. Tell me of this target. The woman offered a slip of parchment with a name and a location. He is a petty noble from Pentos visiting Bravos under the guise of trade. He has offended the merchant who hired us, stolen something precious, and the man's prayers have reached the many-faced god. You must slip into his lodging and deliver the gift without being seen. You must become no one. Return when it is done. And no death but his. Ned stared at the parchment. The name meant nothing to him. Likely just another tangle of trade rivalries. But if he balked, he would fail. He realized with dread that he had reached the threshold. To truly join the Faceless men, he must commit murder at their direction. This was no act of war or self-defense. It was an assassin's contract, plain and simple. He breathed in slowly. In the old days, he would have refused outright. But Eddard Stark was gone. If he wanted the power to strike at those who had torn his life apart, this was the price. He nodded. I understand. Then go, said the kindly man. We shall be watching. That night, Ned roamed the dark streets of Bravos, disguised as a drunken sellsword. The lodging was a small but well-guarded house near the moon pool. The target was rumored to keep 2 hired Bravos in his employ. Ned circled the perimeter, noting the windows and doors, waiting for the darkest hour. He steeled himself, reminding himself that this was a test of skill and resolve. The many-faced god demanded a sacrifice. He had chosen this path. When the time came, Ned scaled a low rooftop, then dropped silently into the target's courtyard. A guard dozed at a corner, slack-jawed. Ned crept past him. The house's back door was bolted, but Ned had learned certain tricks from the priests. A thin blade of metal and a twist of the wrist, and the bolt slid free. Inside, the hallway was dimly lit by a single lantern. He could hear snoring. He moved like a shadow, heart pounding. He found the target's chamber soon enough, a locked door at the end of the corridor. The lock was more complex, but again his training served. He slipped inside. The Pentoshi noble lay on a bed, richly appointed in silk sheets. A single candle burned on a small table. The man was middle-aged with a heavy paunch. He snored softly. Ned stared at him, recalling the moment he'd first seen King Robert snoring in a drunken stupor at Winterfell so many years ago. This man was not Robert, though, and Ned was no longer the same. He drew forth a small vial of poison, removing the stopper carefully. A single drop would suffice to end this man's life without a sound. He poured it into the wine cup on the bedside table, stirring it with a careful finger so as not to leave a residue. Then he set the cup back. The man would awaken, reach for his wine, and die swiftly. The gift of the many-faced god delivered. Yet something made Ned pause, holding the empty vial in his hand, looking upon the sleeping figure. This was the first time he had killed someone unambiguously outside of war or self-defense. A part of him cried out that it was dishonorable, that it was vile. Another part of him insisted that the old codes had nearly destroyed him. This was the path to the power he needed. He forced himself to remain steady. He turned to leave, pausing only to ensure there was no trace left behind. Then he slipped out as silently as he had come. By dawn, the noble would be dead. By midday, Ned would stand before the kindly-faced man and the ebony-eyed woman, offering proof that the deed was done. He felt sick inside, but also determined. This was the cost. He could not look away. He returned to the temple in the pre-dawn hush. The kindly-faced man greeted him with a nod, betraying no emotion. The ebony-eyed woman simply said, "Your task is finished. Go and rest. We shall summon you when the time is right." Ned retreated to his cell, sinking onto the straw mat. His hands trembled and a hollow feeling gnawed at his chest. He had taken a life, someone who posed him no personal threat at the bidding of others. In his old life, he might have called that murder. Now it was merely another step. He waited for guilt to crush him, but instead found a grim acceptance. This was who he had become, a man capable of murder in the name of a higher craft. Days later, the priests deemed him ready for deeper initiation. He was taken to a subterranean chamber, lit by braziers that glowed with unnatural warmth. The kindly-faced man guided Ned to a stone slab, instructing him to lie down. He was given a small vial of a thick, sweet-smelling liquid. "Drink," said the man. "Fear no harm. This is merely the next step to shed your old face." Ned swallowed the potion. At once his senses swam. A dizziness overcame him. He felt a creeping cold across his skin. Shadows flickered on the walls, dancing in shapes that reminded him of the weirwoods back in the north. He closed his eyes, drifting between waking and sleeping. He was dimly aware of voices chanting in a language he did not recognize. Time lost meaning. There were images, dreams, or visions. He thought he saw Arya's face morph into Sansa's, then into the face of a dire wolf. He saw King's Landing burning, the Iron Throne melting into slag, a figure in black standing triumphant among ashes. He saw a reflection in a mirror that was not his own. Then darkness. When he awoke, he was lying on the stone slab, shivering. The kindly-faced man stood over him along with the ebony-eyed woman. "Rise, if you can," the man said. Ned sat up, his head throbbing. He glanced at his hands. They looked slightly different, slimmer, paler. Or was it a trick of the brazier light? He touched his face and found unfamiliar contours. He felt panic for a moment. Had they changed him already, stolen his face and replaced it? But as his head cleared, he realized it was only partial. His face was still there, just altered somehow, a subtle shift that was difficult to describe. The woman offered him a polished metal disc as a mirror. Ned peered into it, seeing a face that was almost his own, but not quite. Slight differences to the nose, the brow, the jaw. Enough that a passing acquaintance might not recognize him. He was a ghost of Eddard Stark and Echo. He reeled, trying to process. "This is the beginning," said the woman softly. "If you remain with us, if you embrace the faceless path, you will learn to shift your face fully. But only if you cast aside your old self. To cling to your past is to fail." Ned heard his own voice rasping from unfamiliar lips. "I understand." From then on, training intensified. No one continued to refine the arts of disguise and subterfuge. He was sent on more tasks to prove his loyalty, always guided by the priest's silent watchers. Each time, a small part of him died, replaced by a sharper edge of cunning. Yet beneath it all, the memory of who he'd been lingered like a ghost. He knew he must keep that ember alive, if only for the sake of his children. He had not thrown away all of his old loyalties, he'd merely hidden them under layers of new faces. Seasons shifted. The Braavosi winter was damp and cold, though mild compared to the biting gales of the north. Ned barely noticed the passing of time, so engrossed was he in the temple's demands. The day finally came when the kindly-faced man approached him in the courtyard where Ned practiced the art of knife-throwing. Without preamble, the priest said, "You have come far. You are not yet ready to wear every face, but you have proven you can kill on command, you can abandon your old name, and you can survive our lessons. There is one final test we would have you undertake." Ned set the knife aside, wiping sweat from his brow. "Tell me what must be done." The priest's smile was barely perceptible. "There is a certain pirate lord from Lys. He has come to Braavos. He landed 2 days ago. He has dealings with slavers and abomination in the eyes of our client. We have received a request for the gift. Deliver it and do so with no trace. If you succeed, you will be given your first true face and welcomed as an acolyte of the Faceless Men." Ned inhaled slowly. Another killing. Another step deeper into this life. But behind the swirl of dread, he recognized that once he passed this threshold, he would possess the power and authority to move more freely, even possibly to return to Westeros in time. And that was his deeper purpose, however much he kept it hidden. "Where can I find him?" Ned asked. The priest provided the details. The pirate lord kept a suite in an expensive Braavosi inn, guarded by fierce Sel's words. He rarely left the premises, preferring to indulge in wine and women inside. The job was to be done quickly, cleanly, leaving no suspicion of the temple's involvement. Ned nodded, formulating a plan in his mind. That night, Chloe Ked in one of the disguises he had crafted, a portly merchant with a tuft of gray hair and a foreign accent. He made his way to the inn. The Sel's words eyed him warily. He pretended to be a wine seller with a special cask from Dorne. A bribe here and there, and they let him pass into a small antechamber. There, he encountered 2 more guards, big men with curved swords. One scowled at him. "Pirate Lord doesn't need more wine," he growled. "He's had enough to drown a whale." Ned gave a jovial laugh in his merchant persona, pulling out 2 coins from a hidden pouch. "A gift from a prospective partner," he said, voice muffled by the fake mustache. The guards hesitated, then nodded. "Go on then, but if you cause trouble, I'll hang your guts on the wall," one said. Ned bowed in mock gratitude. They opened the door to a lavish suite. Inside, smoke from incense hung heavy in the air, and Ned heard soft music playing. The pirate lord lay on a couch, half naked, with a girl fanning him, while 2 more women giggled on a side divan. The man had a broad face with pockmarks, greasy black hair, and a wide grin that made Ned's skin crawl. "Wine? the pirate lord demanded, eyeing Ned. "Bring it here, merchant." Ned approached slowly, one hand on the cask spigot. He bowed, rattling off some inane line about this being a rare vintage meant to delight men of taste. The pirate lord waved dismissively, but his eyes glimmered with greedy interest. Ned poured a cup, handing it to the man. Under his breath, Ned murmured an apology in the old tongue of the North, a final shred of guilt for taking a life. Then, as the pirate lifted the cup to his lips, Ned lunged. He drew a thin stiletto from the false bottom of the cask. Before the pirate or the startled women could scream, Ned sank the blade cleanly into the man's throat, angled upward. A gurgle, and the pirate lord's eyes went wide. Ned ripped the blade free, blood spraying across the cushions. The women gasped, scrambling backward in horror. "Guards!" one screamed. Ned turned and hurled a small clay ball toward the door. It shattered, releasing a cloud of pungent smoke. Chaos erupted. The pirate lord's limp body slumped over, wine spilling across the floor. Ned darted for the window. He scrambled onto the sill, ignoring the pounding steps of the cellswards, and leapt into the canal below. The cold water engulfed him. He kicked, chest burning. He emerged amid a swirl of ripples, hearing shouts above. But the darkness cloaked him, and he swam away, disappearing into one of Bravos's many side canals. Soaked and shivering, he eventually pulled himself onto a narrow walkway in a secluded district. He coughed, tasting brine and blood in his mouth. His disguise had come partly undone, the mustache hanging askew. Yet he'd done it. The pirate lord was dead, exactly as demanded. He knew that if the guards pieced together the truth, it would only be rumors of a faceless killer. Another successful contract. Ned returned to the temple, slipping inside by a hidden entrance. He found the kindly-faced man waiting in the courtyard. He spoke only one word, "Done." Ned nodded. "Done. Good," said the priest. "Come." He led Ned deeper into the temple, through corridors Ned had never entered. At last, they reached a chamber ringed with strange masks. Each mask hung upon the wall with silent vigilance. Some were made of leather, others of metal, some looked carved from wood. Among them, shapes of men, women, children, old and young, etched in uncanny detail. The kindly-faced man gestured in a slow arc around the chamber. "These are the faces that have been worn by our servants in the past, offered as gifts by those who died here or joined our order. You are close to wearing one yourself." Ned trembled, not entirely sure if he was prepared for that final metamorphosis. The priest continued, "Yet there is still a piece of you that clings to who you were. We sense your thoughts, your hesitation. You have done what we asked, but your heart is not yet empty. What do you hide?" Ned's throat tightened. He wondered if they somehow knew about his vow of vengeance. Perhaps they even guessed he kept his memories alive for the sake of his daughters. He forced himself to remain calm. "Nothing. I am no one." The priest's gaze bored into him. "We shall see." Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed something onto the floor at Ned's feet. It was a small strip of leather with a wolf's head sigil, the dire wolf of House Stark, stained with old blood. "We found this in your cell, hidden in your straw bed." Ned stared, his mind racing. He'd carried that small token unconsciously, one final memento of his house, of Winterfell. He told himself it was just a scrap of leather, that it didn't matter. But the priests had discovered it. The kindly-faced man's eyes glinted. "You lied to us, Eddard Stark." His voice was suddenly cold. "You have not truly abandoned your name. You have not embraced being no one." Ned's heart pounded. He felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Fear of being cast out, anger at the priest's intrusion, shame at the betrayal, but also defiance. "You knew who I was from the start." "Indeed," the priest said, "but if you cannot let go of that name, you cannot fully join our ranks. And yet your skill has grown. Perhaps you are not destined to be one of us entirely, but we have taught you much, too much to let you simply leave. There remains a choice." Ned's grip tightened around the hilt of his knife, uncertain. "What choice?" The priest spread his hands. Either we cast you into the black pool, and your life ends here, one more gift to the many-faced God, or you swear on your blood and soul that you will never speak of our secrets, that you will use what you have learned only for the God's designs. We will let you depart as a rogue, a half-formed disciple. But know that if you break this vow, if you ever betray the temple's secrets, we will find you. No face will hide you from us. Do you understand? A hush lay between them. Ned's mind raced. He could not truly become a faceless man, for that would mean giving up all hope of saving Sansa and avenging the betrayal. But he also wanted to live, to return to Westeros eventually, to wield the skills he had gained. The second option was dangerous, a life on the run from an order of master assassins if he misstepped. But it was the only path forward. At length, Ned bowed his head. I understand. Then so be it, said the priest. He nodded to the ebony-eyed woman standing behind Ned, who silently approached. She produced a small obsidian blade. Bare your arm, the kindly-faced man commanded. Ned pushed up his sleeve, exposing his forearm. The woman took the blade and cut a shallow slice, drawing a thin line of blood. Swear now, she said softly, that you shall never betray the secrets of the House of Black and White. Ned kept his voice steady. I so swear. She placed her hand over the cut, smearing the blood. Then she let go. Then begone. You have no place here. But go with the knowledge that we shall be watching. Ned nodded, heart-hammering. Without a word, he turned and left that dreadful chamber, moving through the temple's corridors one last time. He took only what he wore and a small pack of supplies the priests thrust at him. The doors of Black and White parted before him. Stepping into the Braavosi sun, he took a shaking breath. His face, still slightly altered from the temple's potions, remained his. But now he was a man without a home, neither Eddard Stark nor fully no one. He made his way to a remote quay where a handful of ships were moored. Despite the swirl of confusion, a grim satisfaction brewed in him. He had learned the ways of stealth and murder from the greatest killers in the known world. He was no longer the honorable lord of Winterfell, naive and easily trapped. Now he was a shade, a man who could move unseen, strike without warning. He would return to Westeros, though not immediately. He had to be careful, to prepare, to choose his moment. The Lannisters thought him dead. Let them keep thinking so until the time came for him to emerge from the darkness. He boarded a small merchant cog bound for Pentos, paying the fare with coin the temple had provided. As the ship departed Braavos, Ned stood at the rail, watching the city recede. The Titan loomed once more, as if mocking him with its stony gaze. He was leaving the temple as a renegade, a half-trained, faceless man. The path ahead was uncertain, strewn with danger. Yet vengeance beckoned. Ned whispered under his breath, Vala Morgulus, remembering the lesson taught in the House of Black and White. All men must die king, queen, traitor, or friend. He intended to make certain that those who had destroyed his life would meet that end sooner rather than later. If he had to bide his time for months, even years, he would. Eddard Stark was dead. But the phantom who remained could still wield a blade in the night. And one day, the red gold lion would roar no more. In Pentos, Ned found safe harbor in a cramped inn along the waterfront. The city bustled with exotic splendor, with merchant princes and flamboyant courtiers. He did not linger. He merely needed to replenish his supplies and discover tidings from Westeros. The scraps of gossip he overheard spoke of growing wars. Robb Stark had declared himself king in the north. The Lannisters battled him, while Stannis Baratheon rose against the Iron Throne from Dragonstone. And somewhere in the midst of all this, Sansa Stark remained a pawn in King's Landing. Ned's hand tightened around a cup of sour wine. If he could slip into Westeros, if he could get close to Joffrey or Cersei, he might put a knife in their hearts and vanish. The thought sent a shiver of excitement and dread through him. But he had to be patient. If he arrived in Westeros without a plan, he would be exposing himself to certain death. The Lannisters had spies everywhere. Even though they believed him dead, a rumor could still arise. No, he needed cunning and time. He had new faces he could wear, temporary illusions, if not the full magical transformations of a true faceless man. He still possessed the skill to disguise himself and pass unnoticed. And so he spent weeks plotting in Pentos, forging the identity of a traveling merchant named Garen, practicing the accent, adopting subtle mannerisms. He dyed what remained of his hair and beard a dark brown, trimming it close, and wore baggy silks to hide his more muscular build. In a mirror, he could scarcely see the old Ned. His eyes, though, still carried the North's solemn gray. Once prepared, he joined a small caravan of merchants crossing the narrow sea by galley, landing near Gulltown. From there, they would ride overland through the Vale of Arryn, a route that would eventually lead them south. Ned recalled the Vale from years ago, back when Robert Baratheon had fostered with Jon Arryn. Memories twinged, but he brushed them aside. He was no one now, just a merchant traveling with a band of coin-hungry men. They landed at Gulltown on a cold morning. The Vale's looming mountains stood like silent sentinels. The merchant group hired mules and pack horses to carry goods. Ned blended among them, hardly speaking. He observed everything, noticing how the local lords had aligned themselves in the chaos of the wars. Rumor had it that the Vale was kept out of much of the fighting by Lady Lisa Arryn's isolation. But tensions simmered under the surface. On the second night of their journey, the merchants made camp near a mountain pass. Ned stood watch while the others slept. The wind howled through the rocks. He thought of Winterfell, how the wind would moan across the battlements at night, and he felt an ache in his chest. Would he ever see that home again? The Starks of Winterfell, his father, Brandon, Lyanna, were all ghosts now. He wondered if Robb yet lived, or if he'd fallen to the Lannister swords. If by some miracle Sansa and Arya were safe, if Bran still dreamed of climbing. He closed his eyes, letting the wind carry his silent prayer. They pressed on. Eventually, they reached the high road that wound along the sheer cliffs of the Vale. At each turn, Ned saw the vastness of the region, recalling how it had once comforted him in his younger years. Now it felt foreign, as though belonging to another life. The caravan pressed southward, heading toward the Riverlands. Ned remained with them, quietly paying his way, occasionally offering bits of coin from a hidden pouch. He took care not to stand out. When they reached the Riverlands, they found devastation. War had swept through. Fields burned, villages emptied. Frightened small folk eyed them from shattered doorways. Tension hung in the air like a gathering storm. The merchants cursed their ill luck, for trade was near impossible in a region so ravaged. At a small, half-ruined inn, they learned that Robb Stark, the young wolf, had won several victories against the Lannisters, but the war was far from over. King Joffrey still held King's Landing. Tywin Lannister marched his forces across the land, clashing with the River Lords. Death was everywhere. Ned listened, carefully gleaning information. If King's Landing was still under Lannister control, then Sansa remained in their clutches. That knowledge made his blood simmer with hatred. Perhaps he could slip into the capital under a merchant guise. The city would be on edge, but with the skill he possessed, he might pass unnoticed. And once inside, Joffrey had to die. Cersei as well. If only he could free Sansa. The risk was enormous. The city teemed with Lannister guards. But an assassin in the night, a ghost from the House of Black and White, perhaps it was possible. Late one evening, the caravan decided to turn west, hoping to find safer trade routes. Ned claimed he had business in the Crownlands. They warned him it was a fool's errand. He thanked them but parted ways. Alone, he rode a borrowed mule across the scarred countryside, skirting battle lines, evading patrols by sleeping in forests and traveling by the lesser roads. He hid by day and moved by night when needed, recalling his training. He was a shadow gliding across a land at war. The closer he came to King's Landing, the more the roads filled with refugees and scavengers. Broken men wandered, telling tales of outrages committed by both sides. The stench of decay lingered in the fields. Ned kept his head down, hood drawn, forging onward. He approached the city from the south, crossing the Blackwater by a humble ferry well downstream from the main roads. When at last the walls of King's Landing rose into view, he felt a surge of conflicting emotions, terror, anger, grim purpose. He was truly returning to the place he had almost lost his life, the city that believed him dead. The city that imprisoned his daughter. Now he came not as Eddard Stark, but as a faceless killer in search of vengeance. The idea that he might be risking all for revenge weighed on him. But he thought of Sansa in that viper's nest, forced to endure Joffrey's cruelties. He thought of Arya, who might one day wander back to that city, only to find her father's ghost. He thought of the final words Varys had given him in the dungeon, that mercy might still be found if Ned could outmaneuver the queen. He tightened his resolve. The Lannisters had no idea what he had become. No notion that the honorable wolf had learned to prowl as a silent cat. He would bide his time, slip into the Red Keep, do what must be done. He had spent months training under the harshest teachers of the dark arts. Now the night was his ally, and the many-faced god watched from a distance. As dusk settled, he passed through the gates with a group of ragged travelers. The guards barely glanced at him, preoccupied with the throngs of refugees. Once inside, he slipped into the tangle of King's Landing streets, heart-pounding. The city smelled of sewage and sweat, of fear and greed. Torchlight flickered in the windows of cramped hovels, while the Red Keep loomed ominously atop its hill. That was where Joffrey sat, that was where Sansa remained, that was where Cersei schemed. Ned had come full circle, but this time he was a shadow. He checked into a small, discreet inn in Flea Bottom, paying in copper pennies. He dared not draw attention by seeking out old acquaintances, for all he knew they might betray him or be under watch. So he spent the next days moving carefully through the city's districts, gathering intelligence, noting guard patrols. He learned that Sansa was occasionally escorted to the Great September for prayers. Joffrey still reveled in public appearances, but always surrounded by King's Guard. The Queen was seldom seen outside the Red Keep. Rumor had it that Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf, was the new hand of the king. Varys was said to still haunt the corridors, pulling hidden strings. So much had changed, yet so much was the same. Corruption, cruelty, and power plays thrived. Ned spent weeks quietly weaving a plan. He posed as a street vendor, selling spiced wine at corners near the Mudgate, or as a stable hand at a mews near the Dragon Pit ruins. Each disguise gave him vantage, letting him map out the Red Keep's walls, the schedule of patrols, the possible infiltration points. He even considered ways to slip into the keep from the waterfront, recalling the path Varys once used to smuggle him out of the dungeons. The route might still be there, though doubtless more heavily guarded now. Through whispers, he learned that the next royal procession to the Great September would occur in 2 days, with King Joffrey, Queen Cersei, and the royal entourage attending a ceremony for the memory of King Robert. Ned's pulse quickened. That might be his chance to strike. In a public gathering, the security would be formidable, but not impossible to circumvent. If he could get close enough to Joffrey, a single knife thrust could end the boy's reign of terror. Then chaos would erupt. But in that chaos, perhaps Sansa could flee, or Ned could even whisk her away if the opportunity arose. He prepared meticulously, assembling a disguise as a pilgrim come to pay homage to the Seven. He forged wooden prayer beads, wore a simple robe, and shaved part of his hair to change his appearance further. He ground a lethal poison into a fine powder, which could be blown into a victim's face to cause almost instantaneous heart failure. A quick blade might be simpler, but given how Joffrey traveled with bodyguards, poison might be the only chance. The day of the ceremony dawned under a gray sky. Ned took position in the crowds near the Great September's marble steps. Gold cloaks and Lannister guardsmen formed ranks, scanning the throng. The people muttered, hungry and disenchanted, but they bowed as the royal party approached. Joffrey rode in a gilded litter, adorned in finery, his sneer visible even at a distance. Beside him sat Cersei, regal in green velvet. Behind them, the King's Guard in white cloaks, among them the Hound, that scarred giant of a man. And trailing them carefully, Ned glimpsed Sansa. His heart almost stopped. She looked thinner, pale, her eyes downcast. The bright red of her hair was bound in an elegant style, but she seemed frail, a girl trapped in a nightmare. Hatred surged in Ned, fueling him. He drifted closer, hidden in the mass of pilgrims. If he could make his way up the steps, feigning piety, he might come within a few feet of Joffrey. He fingered the small tube of powdered poison hidden in his sleeve. He only needed one short puff aimed at the boy king's face, and it would be done. Joffrey would gasp, clutch his chest, and die writhing on the marble. Poetic justice for the one who had ordered Ned's execution. Yet as the moment approached, his mind whirled. King's Guard, gold cloaks, the Hound. They would react swiftly. Could he escape? Could he save Sansa in the turmoil? He tried to quell his doubts. The many-faced god taught him that all men must die. This was the chance to strike. He forced his way forward through the press of bodies, pulling back his cowl so the guards would not see him as a threat. He bowed, clasping his prayer beads, heart-pounding. The royals ascended the steps. Joffrey smirked at the crowd. Sansa trailed behind, head bowed. Ned was only a dozen paces away. His hand tensed on the hidden tube. Now. Do it now? But in the swirling crush, he suddenly saw Sansa's face lifted, her eyes scanning the crowd. She looked so lost, yet so hopeful, as if searching for some sign of rescue. Her gaze passed over him without recognition, and in that instant, something inside Ned cracked. If he killed Joffrey in front of her, would she be left to the Lannisters' wrath? Cersei would lash out in rage. The city might tear Sansa apart, or the gold cloaks might kill her in the chaos. Could Ned snatch her away in time? The plan had never been fully secure. He had no illusions about taking on the Kingsguard alone. He hesitated. Joffrey passed closer, the perfect moment to strike. Ned's hand shook. If he failed to act, he might never get another chance. Yet the presence of Sansa, so close yet so vulnerable, tore at him. He pictured her being seized by the Hound or Tywin's men, tortured as retribution. The one thing he could not risk was her life. Heart-hammering, Ned lowered his hand. The king's party swept by, oblivious to the assassin in the crowd. Another chance lost, or perhaps spared. Ned slipped away before the ceremony ended, weaving through the throng, cursing himself for failing to carry out his vengeance. But he could not sacrifice his daughter. He needed a new plan, a more precise strike that did not endanger her. Retreating to Flea Bottom, Ned raged silently in his rented room. He had become a killer, yet could not kill. He had come all this way for revenge, yet could not stomach the risk to Sansa. Perhaps the only solution was to free her first, steal her from under the Lannisters' noses, hide her away, and then strike. A nearly impossible task, but the only one his conscience could bear. He recalled that Varys had once guided him through secret passages. If Ned could find them again, perhaps he could sneak into the Red Keep at night, locate Sansa's chambers, and spirit her out under Cloak of Darkness. It would require cunning, bribes, and impeccable timing. But it might be possible. Once Sansa was safe, the Lannisters would have no hostage to stay his hand. Then he could kill Joffrey and Cersei at his leisure. In the gloom of that squalid room, Ned laid out the beginnings of a plan, forging a path of infiltration, one last deception in a city of illusions. He was no longer Lord Eddard Stark, the Honorable. He was a shadow, a man with many faces, shaped by the House of Black and White. All that remained was the determination to shield his daughter, to set right the treachery that had shattered his life, and to repay the Lannisters with the gift they so richly deserved. And though the nights in King's Landing were thick with danger, Ned's will burned brighter now than it ever had before. He was the wolf in the shadows, and soon enough, the lion would learn to fear the silent strike of a man who had died once, only to be reborn in the darkness. The game was not over, it had only just begun. Night deepened over King's Landing, cloaking the vast sprawl of narrow streets and crowded hovels in uneasy quiet. A single candle glimmered in the tiny, cramped room Ned had rented in Flea Bottom. He sat on the edge of the cot, elbows on his knees, staring at the wavering flame. The memory of his near assassination attempt at the Great September tormented him. He had stood mere steps from Joffrey and could have ended the boy's life with one discreet puff of poison, but Sansa's presence had stayed his hand. The risk was too great. Her safety came before vengeance. Yet the need for justice still pounded in his veins. Many times he thought back to that day in the Red Keep's dungeons when everything he believed in, the honor of the crown, the sanctity of the law, had collapsed around him. It seemed a lifetime ago. He had been a different man then, still trusting in open declarations and rightful authority. Now, in the hush of this shabby room, he felt the weight of what he had become, a half-trained faceless man, living by stealth, prepared to kill by guile rather than face his enemies in fair combat. He told himself this was the only way forward. He could not let Sansa suffer at the Lannisters' hands, nor allow the crime done to his family to go unpunished. Still, guilt gnawed at his stomach like a worm in a rotten apple. The faint stench of tallow and unwashed bodies drifted in from the alley below. A drunken voice barked curses at some stray dog. The city was restless at night, fueled by the discontent of war and shortage. Robb's victories in the Riverlands had made the capital uneasy, but so far, the Lannisters held firm. And now Stannis threatened from Dragonstone as well, or so rumor said. An uneasy swirl of alliances was forming, new threats rising on every horizon. Yet for all the strife beyond the walls, Joffrey still sat on the Iron Throne, clutching Sansa like a toy he refused to relinquish. Ned had spent days mapping the Red Keep, refamiliarizing himself with the fortress's layout. Many of the secret passages Varys had revealed to him still existed. The question was whether they remained unguarded. The castle was a spider's web of hidden corridors, tunnels leading from cellars to walls, from old tombs to the Tower of the Hand. Ned believed that if he could gain entry under cover of darkness, he might slip unseen to the royal apartments. But that was only half the battle. Sansa would be heavily guarded. Even in the best of circumstances, removing her would cause a commotion. And once the Lannisters realized she was missing, the city gates would slam shut. Where would they flee? Braavos was too distant, and to ride north through war-torn lands posed monumental challenges. He ran a hand through his hair, still cropped short and dyed dark. It felt foreign beneath his fingers. He closed his eyes, recalling words from his training in the House of Black and White. Patience is a mask, discipline a blade. A man must measure each breath, each step, or lose everything to a single misstep. He needed a precise plan, aided perhaps by discreet allies. The notion of allies in King's Landing made him uneasy. Who here could he trust? One name emerged from memory, Varys, the spider, who had freed him once before, out of motives unknown. Could Ned dare risk contacting him again? In the flame of his candle, Ned pictured Varys's watchful eyes, the half-smile that gave away nothing. The man served the realm, so he claimed, weaving illusions and conspiracies. But in King's Landing, illusions could be as deadly as any sword. Yet if anyone knew how to slip in and out of the Red Keep, it was Varys. Ned's pride balked at relying on the spider again, but he saw no other path that offered even a glimmer of hope. First, he needed to confirm whether Varys was still in the palace. The rumors he'd gleaned from tavern talk said the eunuch remained one of Joffrey's counselors, though overshadowed by Tyrion Lannister, the new hand. Tyrion seemed more cunning than his sister, or so the gossip claimed. If Tyrion suspected that Eddard Stark yet lived, a full manhunt might follow. Ned could not afford a single slip. His newly learned arts of disguise would be tested to their fullest. He smothered the candle, plunging the room into darkness. Feeling along the rough wooden table, he found his pouch of powders and vials, a modest arsenal from the House of Black and White, enough to kill a dozen men if he so desired. But the time for assassination was not yet. Not until Sansa was far beyond the Lannisters' grasp. Only then could he move freely to exact the punishment these traitors deserved. Pulling his hood tight, Ned crept out into the alley. The night was cool but not cold, the air thick with the sour reek of the city. He made his way along twisting lanes, hearing distant laughter from brothels, scuffles in shadowed corners. Once or twice he glimpsed gold cloaks on patrol, their torches casting dancing shadows on the walls. He pressed against the brick, heart-thrumming, letting them pass. He was invisible in the gloom, or so he hoped. When the way was clear, he continued onward, step by silent step. He had learned of an old access point near the king's stables, an ancient drainage tunnel that, in decades past, might have been used to ferry contraband into the Red Keep. Only a rumor gleaned from a drunken ex-guard. But it was worth investigation. If it existed, perhaps Varys used it for his comings and goings. Slipping down a slope of rubble, Ned found the moss-stained opening, half-choked with refuse and old timbers. The tunnel extended beneath the castle walls, or so it seemed. A trickle of filthy water seeped out. The stench nearly made him gag. He pressed a rag to his nose and ventured in, careful with each step on the slick stone. The darkness closed around him. Now and again he touched the wall to keep his bearings. Minutes passed in silent gloom. He heard skittering rats, water dripping from above. The air grew damp and foul. At one point he had to crouch, the ceiling so low it brushed his back. Then the tunnel opened into a wider area. He could just make out a corroded iron grate ahead. Beyond it, the faintest shimmer of torchlight flickered. Ned's pulse quickened. This had to lead somewhere within the keep's perimeter. He tested the grate. Rust flaked off at his touch. It resisted, but with a careful push and twist, he managed to free one hinge from the stone. It made a low screech that made him freeze, heart hammering. He waited, straining for any sound of alarm. None came. He eased the grate aside just enough to squeeze through. Now he was inside, presumably under the keep's grounds, or at least beneath the outer walls. He crept forward, following the dim glow. A few steps brought him to a junction of underground corridors, some lined with cracked stone arches, others mere tunnels lost to darkness. To his left, the flicker of a torch beckoned. He approached quietly and discovered a small sconce burning low on the wall, revealing a half-collapsed passage of carved blocks. Water dribbled along the edge. The floor was strewn with rat droppings and decaying leaves. No guard would patrol such a place unless they had specific reason. Ned breathed slowly. The labyrinth beyond might connect to storerooms or disused cellars. Or it might open onto the dungeons, ironically the place he had escaped months ago. Instead of risking blind wandering, he decided to mark the route. From a pouch, he withdrew a piece of chalk and made a small, unobtrusive symbol on the stone, 2 slashes crossing each other. At least, if he needed to retreat, he could follow the marks back out. He pressed on, moving through silence broken only by his own measured breaths. Once or twice he thought he sensed movement in the shadows, perhaps only rats. Then he came upon a locked door of damp, warped wood. Carefully, he kneeled to inspect the lock by the torch's glow. It was simple enough, a single latch of iron. He pulled out 2 picks from the small kit given to him by the Faceless men. A moment's delicate work and the lock clicked. The door swung open on squealing hinges. Within lay a cramped chamber cluttered with rotting crates half-chewed by vermin. A quick search revealed old bottles of wine, caked in dust and webbing, likely undrinkable. Cobwebs clung to his cloak. The air was stale. On the far side of the room, another door led out, also locked. Ned repeated his trick, his hands steady from practice. The latch yielded. He slipped through and found himself in what appeared to be a corridor with steps leading up. At the top, he saw another faint glow, as if from lamplight beyond a corner. He ascended, each footstep placed with care, mindful of any boards that might creak. The angle of the corridor shifted, curving to the right. Ned soon found that he was entering a broader hallway of stone. Tapestries lined the walls, tattered from neglect. This was no common thoroughfare. It looked like a disused section of the Red Keep's basement level, possibly near the older wings that had fallen out of fashion. He moved behind a length of moth-eaten tapestry and waited, listening for footsteps. None came. A heartbeat later, a faint scuffle made him tense. Then he heard a whisper, so soft he almost missed it. "No need to hide, my lord. You are among friends, or if not friends, at least curious observers." Ned froze, adrenaline surging. That voice was unmistakable. Varys. He parted the tapestry slightly, peering out. The corridor was empty except for a shape that emerged from behind a dusty pillar. A shape cloaked in subtle silks, head shaved, face pale in the lamplight. The spider. Ned stepped out warily, holding no weapon in hand but ready to strike if needed. "You always appear in the most unexpected places." Varys gave a small bow, fingers tenting. "I might say the same of you, though part of me suspected that if Lord Stark were alive, he might try to re-enter the lion's den to rescue his poor daughter." He offered a faint smile. "I am relieved to see you unbroken." Ned regarded the eunuch in silence, measuring his every nuance. "How did you know I was here?" "Spies, whispers, the movement of shadows," Varys said with a shrug. "The Red Keep has many dark corners, and I keep watch on all of them. You're fortunate that I found you first rather than some Lannister guard. Though if I may say, your technique is impressive. I suspect you've gained new skills since last we spoke." Ned felt a surge of caution. "You guessed correctly. Now tell me, are you here to turn me in, or to help?" Varys sighed, affecting wounded pride. "My lord, I have never wished you harm. Quite the contrary. I risked my head to see you safely out of the city once. And no, I will not reveal your presence to the queen or her whelp. I only hope you do not plan something too rash. For Sansa's sake, if for no other reason." Ned advanced a step, tension in his shoulders. "I'm here to free her." "Yes, I surmised as much." Varys lowered his voice. "I confess I do not entirely oppose that notion. The child is trapped in a vile predicament. The king treats her poorly, public scorn, casual cruelty. The poor girl does her best to placate him, but Joffrey is not a kindly soul." Ned's fists clenched at the mental image of Sansa enduring Joffrey's torments. "I won't leave her to that monster." Varys nodded. "I believe you. And it seems you've learned caution since last time. Bravery tempered with guile and improvement. Have you come alone?" "I can trust no one else," Ned said softly, watching for Varys' reaction. "So you say, and yet you're speaking to me." Varys tilted his head. "Yes, well, I offer no guarantee of unwavering allegiance, but let us say our interests align. If you can remove Sansa, it thwarts the Queen's hold over the north. That might, depending on how events unfold, be beneficial to the realm." Ned exhaled. "If you know a way to get her out unseen, speak plainly." Varys offered a delicate sigh. "Alas, there is no straightforward route. The Red Keep teams with guards, and Sansa's own maidservants are loyal to the Queen. The slightest hint of a plot to free her would bring the castle down in fury. Yet there might be a sliver of opportunity in the near future. Joffrey is planning a demonstration soon to show the people he's strong. There will be a public audience in the throne room and afterward a small feast for the courtiers. Sansa will be by his side, as always. A good portion of the household guard will be diverted for the public spectacle. That might leave the princess's chambers less watched." Ned's mind raced. "When?" "In 3 days. At midday. The city will be on edge, but the Red Keep itself will have to allow some outsiders in for the ceremony, lords and ladies, a few favored commoners. If you move then, the Queen's focus will be on the event. Sansa's own rooms might be temporarily unguarded or at least guarded by fewer men if the routine is predictable. And how do I move her out of the castle once I get to her? Ned asked. The gates will be manned. Varys pursed his lips, considering. There is a postern gate behind Maegor's holdfast, rarely used, that opens to a steep stair descending to the Blackwater. Usually it's locked, but I do have a key. That might suffice if you can get Sansa away undetected. You would, however, need someone to create a distraction near the gate, someone to occupy or bribe the guards. Can you arrange that? The spider's lips curved faintly. I might, but discreetly. 1 or 2 guards might be persuaded to step away, especially if well paid or provided a reason to chase a phantom intruder. Once you slip out, there should be a small skiff waiting at the quay below. If you reach the boat, you can slip down river, perhaps meet a ship outside the city. I can't promise safe passage beyond that, but it's more than you have now. Ned searched the eunuch's eyes, trying to see if treachery lurked there. It was impossible to tell, but this was more of a plan than he had managed on his own. He gave a curt nod. I'll do it. Excellent. Varys reached into his voluminous sleeve and withdrew a small iron key on a leather thong. The key to the postern gate. Keep it safe. He offered it to Ned, who accepted it warily. You must time your entry carefully. The demonstration is at midday, so the best moment to move is likely sometime during the feast that follows. The Queen and Joffrey will be occupied with their guests, and Sansa's normal keepers might assume she's at the feast as well, though in truth you'll already have taken her from her chambers. Ned breathed slowly, imagining the steps. If Sansa is not in her rooms at that hour, I'll need to intercept her in the corridors. Far too risky, Varys said. Make sure she doesn't appear at the feast at all. The moment she's missed, the alarm goes out. If you want even a fraction of an hour's grace, you must take her before she's summoned. The Queen's routine has her ladies attend to Sansa's attire a short while before the meal. If you can slip in and remove her then, quietly, the ladies might just assume the girl left earlier with a different escort. It could buy you precious minutes. Ned mulled it over, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. So be it. Varys laid a hand on Ned's shoulder, a strangely intimate gesture. Be cautious, my lord. And watch for Tyrion as well. He is canny and not without sympathy in some matters, but he is a Lannister all the same. Do not underestimate him. If things go awry, it may be him you contend with, more so than Cersei. I'll remember, Ned said, stepping back, his voice gruff. Thank you for this. Varys gave a shallow bow. I do what I can for the realm. Then he turned and ghosted away down the corridor, disappearing into the gloom. Ned lingered only a moment before retracing his steps to the tunnel entrance, using the chalk marks to guide him. The sense of precarious relief coursed through him. He had a plan now. A fragile, uncertain plan, but better than nothing. 3 days. In that time, he must gather all the resources he could muster. And he must not fail. He made his way back to Flea Bottom before dawn, emerging from the reeking drainage exit into an alley. Muttering a silent prayer to the old gods, he prayed that Sansa would survive the coming attempt, that he might finally hold her safe in his arms. When morning light filtered through the grime-streaked shutters of his rented room, Ned was already awake, laying out the components of his next disguise. He needed to enter the Red Keep during the feast. Possibly he would pass as a servant or a minor retainer of some noble house, blending with the swirl of visitors that often came to court. He studied the items he had collected: a brown doublet, scuffed boots, a tarnished belt buckle, a short dagger. He'd purchased them piecemeal in different markets to avoid suspicion. All needed to be worn in carefully so they would look natural. He planned to darken his eyebrows further with a smear of lampblack, to whiten his beard with chalk dust. If he pitched his voice a bit higher and affected a certain limp, even the keenest observer might not see Lord Eddard Stark beneath. He spent the next days refining the disguise, memorizing the manner of a minor court official, the stooped posture, the obsequious tone. Whenever he ventured into the city, he tested the look on unsuspecting bystanders, speaking with a changed accent. No one gave him a second glance. That was the best sign of all. At the same time, he assembled what he called his escape pack. It contained rope, a few slender tools for picking locks, spare clothes for Sansa in case she needed to shed her courtly gown, a small supply of dried fruit and cheese for the flight, and a sealed vial of a mild sleeping draught. He had no illusions that Sansa might be terrified or distraught. If she panicked, he might have to calm her quickly, though the thought of using such means on his daughter twisted his stomach. Still, he prepared for every possibility. He also scouted possible safe houses if the boat should fail or if the city gates locked down too soon. The city was enormous. In its warrens, a desperate fugitive might hide for a time, but not forever. Perhaps if they could lay low until dark, then slip out a lesser gate. He left some coin with a dockside innkeeper who seemed unscrupulous enough to keep quiet if Ned needed a back entrance for a night. It was the best he could do given the constraints. The morning of the third day arrived with a bright sun that made the city almost cheerful. Carts rattled through the streets, carrying supplies and a few meager offerings for the looming feast. Word had spread that Joffrey intended to show generosity by feeding certain chosen commoners. The impoverished masses, starved for hope, eagerly believed any rumor of a charitable king. Ned ground his teeth, how little they knew of Joffrey's true nature. Still, large crowds might provide him cover. He donned the disguise in his rented room, checking each detail in a small polished shard of mirror. The reflection showed a balding man with a streaked beard, stooped shoulders, and a faintly fretful expression. Only the gray eyes remained distinctly Ned's, but with the lampblack around the lids, they appeared smaller. Satisfied, he gathered his escape pack and slung it over his shoulder. The postern gate key hung on a cord beneath his doublet. For a weapon, he carried only a short stiletto hidden in his boot. He had also brought a tiny pinch of the most potent poison he possessed in case he faced an unavoidable confrontation. Stepping into the daylight, he joined the flow of people heading toward the Red Keep. The castle gates were open, as was typical on days of royal functions, to admit minor lords, tradesmen, and those with business inside. Gold cloaks inspected some arrivals, but many were waved through if they looked harmless. Ned joined a small group of scribes who clutched sheaves of parchment. When the guard asked his purpose, Ned mumbled in a trembling voice, "I'm with Lord Giles Rosby's retinue. Delivery of accounts for the master of coin." The guard looked bored, waved him on. Just like that, Ned was inside. The Red Keep's outer ward bustled with activity. Servants hurried about with crates of fruit, casks of wine, and trays of sweetmeats. Some knights stood by, polishing armor or gossiping in low tones. The throng pressed in, giving Ned ample chance to slip away unnoticed. He made for an archway leading deeper into the keep, ignoring the main route to the throne room. Already he could hear trumpets sounding in the distance, announcing the king's procession. The official ceremony would begin soon. He ducked into a side corridor, scanning for any sign of watchers. The hush of these passages felt eerie, the bustle of the outer ward fading behind him. He needed to reach Maegor's Holdfast, the secure inner fortress within the Red Keep where the royal family's private chambers lay. The Holdfast was separated by a dry moat and a drawbridge that was usually guarded. That posed a formidable barrier. Walking briskly, Ned approached the path that led to the drawbridge. As expected, he found 2 guards posted there, each wearing Lannister crimson, halberds in hand. They seemed at ease, chatting quietly, but he knew they would turn away any unauthorized visitors. He paused behind a column, mind racing. Perhaps Varys had arranged a distraction, or perhaps Ned would have to create one himself. Moments later, a swirl of movement approached from the corner, a group of singing minstrels in bright attire, accompanied by a pair of tumblers cartwheeling along. They headed for the drawbridge, presumably invited to provide entertainment during the feast. The guards eyed them warily. One guard stepped forward to intercept them, demanding to see some token of permission. At that instant, a voice echoed down a side hallway, "Fire! Fire in the tapestry room!" It was enough to draw the second guard's immediate attention. Both men glanced at each other, uncertain. The minstrels shouted in confusion. Ned smiled grimly. Perhaps that was Varys's doing. While the guards were caught in the distraction, Ned slipped into the group of minstrels. He stooped low, feigning to help them with an errant harp case. The tumblers, confused, kept performing flips for a moment. One guard shouted at them to move aside. Then the other guard was suddenly called by another voice. "Quickly! Come help! The flames are spreading!" The first guard barked an order at the minstrels to wait. He and his companion rushed toward the corridor from which the alarm had come. The minstrels stood there, perplexed, but Ned took advantage at once. He moved swiftly across the drawbridge, footsteps light. No one blocked his way. He made it to the heavy door on the far side leading into the holdfast. Another guard should have been posted, but apparently also ran off to aid with the supposed fire. Ned slipped inside. He found himself in a short passage that opened into a spacious foyer of sorts, with marble floors and tall windows looking into the central courtyard of Maegor's Holdfast. He kept to the walls, stepping behind a pillar as 2 ladies-in-waiting passed, giggling about the king's generosity or some rumored scandal. They did not see him. He recalled from memory and from scraps of gossip where Sansa's bedchamber was located. The third level above the courtyard, in the same wing once given to highborn hostages and wards. The main stair was typically well-trafficked, but with the feast approaching, the corridors might be nearly empty, or else filled with ladies rushing to change. He must be cautious. He took a servant's back stair instead, one used for hauling laundry. It was cramped, but deserted. Up he went, counting steps to keep track. On the third level, he exited into a narrower hallway lined with paneling and a few small alcoves. The windows overlooked a garden below. A hush filled the space, broken only by distant noise of the festivities. He moved quickly, checking doors. Some were locked, some slightly ajar, revealing storage rooms or vacant chambers. At last he found a door with a carved falcon crest on the frame, once used for some minor errand retainer, he supposed. But now, rumor said it was Sansa's assigned chamber or close to it. He pressed an ear to the wood, listening. No sound. Heart pounding, Ned tried the latch. Locked. He drew out his picks, sweat beading on his temple. The lock was not complicated. Within a few moments, he heard the click. He eased the door open, peering inside. A modestly furnished room greeted him. A curtained bed, a small dresser, and a mirror by the window. Garments lay folded on a trunk, including what appeared to be a fine green gown, no doubt intended for the feast. No sign of Sansa. He slipped in, quietly closing the door. The chamber smelled faintly of lavender and rosewater. A pang of sorrow shot through him, recalling how Catelyn used to scent her hair. He forced it down. He must find Sansa before she was summoned to the feast. A door on the far side likely led to an antechamber or a dressing room. He moved to it, knocking softly. "Sansa?" he whispered. No response. He tried the handle. It turned. Inside, a smaller space with a polished mirror stand and a rack of gowns. Sitting there, half turned toward the door, was Sansa, eyes red from crying. She gasped, clutching a brush in her hand as though it were a weapon. She looked at him in confusion. His disguise must have thrown her. He whispered, "Sansa, it's me, father." Her eyes widened. A shiver seized her, and she dropped the brush. "Father?" she managed, voice trembling. "But you're dead," they said. Tears sprang up, and she seemed on the verge of fainting. Ned pulled off his false beard and let the lampblack smudge away from his face with a quick wipe of his sleeve. He hurried toward her, pressing a gentle hand to her cheek. "Hush, child. It's all right. I'm here. I'm alive." She stared, her breath hitching. "This must be a dream. I saw your head, or what I thought was your head on the walls." He embraced her gently, heart aching at how frail she felt, how thin her arms were. They lied. It was someone else's head or a deception. "I managed to escape. I've come to take you away." She clung to him, sobbing quietly. I can't believe it." For a moment, she could say no more. He stroked her hair, letting her cry. At length, her tears subsided enough for her to speak. "The Queen, Joffrey, I tried to do as they said, to keep them from hurting me. Father, the things they made me watch." She shook violently. "I know," Ned murmured, voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry, my sweet girl. I should have acted sooner. But I'm here now." She swallowed, wiping her tears with trembling fingers. "If they find you, they'll kill you. They'll kill me too. We can't." "We can," he said firmly. "Right now. We'll leave by a secret way. There's a boat waiting." Sansa's face flickered with panic and hope in equal measure. She looked at the green gown on the trunk. "I'm supposed to wear that. The Queen wants me in the throne room soon. That's exactly why we must go at once. If they come for you and you're gone, we'll have only minutes before the alarm is raised. So we must move quickly, quietly." He reached into his pack, withdrawing a plain cloak of dark wool. "Put this on over whatever you wear. Dress lightly. We'll need to slip through hidden passages. No jewelry that might jingle." She hesitated only a moment before nodding, her resolve tightening. "Yes, let's go." She stood, smoothing her simple shift. Then she took the cloak and wrapped it around herself. Ned offered her a pair of soft-soled shoes from his pack. She slipped them on, discarding her court slippers. He took her trembling hand. "Stay close. If anyone sees us, follow my lead. We'll act as if you're a maidservant. Keep your head down." They returned to the outer chamber and stepped to the door, listening. The corridor was empty. Ned peered both ways. A faint rumble of distant voices drifted up from below, likely from the feast. Good, let them be distracted, he thought. He led Sansa out, guiding her to the servants' stair. They descended carefully, each step measured to avoid a betraying creak. Sansa's breath came in soft, quick pants, her nerves on edge. At the second level, they paused in the shadows. Voices echoed from somewhere nearby, a pair of maids chattering about the festival. Ned pressed Sansa back against the wall, hidden behind a pillar until the maids' voices receded. Then they continued down to the ground floor. Now came the more perilous part, crossing the courtyard of Maegor's Holdfast. The morning's distraction had drawn some guards away, but more might be posted by now. The sun shone brightly through the open doors leading to the yard. Ned ventured a quick glance. He saw 2 Lannister guards standing near the well, apparently gossiping. Another pair leaned by the stable door. That was 4 too many. He grit his teeth. They needed a diversion or a route around. There was a colonnade leading to the kitchens that might provide partial cover. He turned to Sansa, speaking low. "Stay behind me. We'll stick to the shadows under the colonnade. If they challenge us, let me do the talking. If they approach, run back inside." Her eyes were wide, but she nodded. Ned led her forward, slipping along the interior wall to a side door that opened onto the courtyard's colonnade. Sunlight streamed through arches, but the corridor itself was dim. They moved quietly, half-crouched. The guards by the well continued their conversation, oblivious. The other pair by the stable were out of direct sight. Step by step, Ned guided Sansa along the colonnade. His stomach tightened with each footfall, aware how a single stray glance could ruin everything. Halfway across, he heard a sudden shout from the direction of the stable. He froze, pulling Sansa behind a column. The shout came again, though he couldn't make out words. Then, unexpectedly, a great clamor erupted as a stable boy ran out, arms flailing. The Queen's mare kicked him. "Help!" Another stable ant followed, cursing. The Lannister guards rushed over, drawn by the commotion. Ned seized the moment. Now he whispered and hurried along the colonnade to the far side. Sansa kept pace, face taut with fear. They slipped into another passage leading off the courtyard where a wide corridor traversed the ground level of the Holdfast. Miraculously, no one stood guard there. They continued until they reached the door that gave onto the drawbridge. Ned pressed his ear to the wood, hearing distant shouts. Possibly from the feast, possibly from the stable fiasco. Gathering his courage, he pushed the door open a crack. The drawbridge was lowered, but the 2 original guards had returned, scanning around anxiously. Perhaps the fire alarm had been contained. Ned ducked back inside. Sansa's hand clutched his arm, and he felt her trembling. He had no illusions about fighting both guards without raising an alarm. They needed them gone, or at least distracted. Before he could formulate a plan, a familiar figure emerged on the far side, stepping into view, Varys. The eunuch was flanked by a stout man in the uniform of the City Watch. Varys pointed animatedly at something behind them, drawing the guards' attention. The watchman joined in, shouting about an incident near the kitchens. The guards hesitated, looking uncertain whether to leave. Varys pressed them, gesturing in a flustered manner that seemed entirely real. At last, the pair jogged off with the watchman, leaving the drawbridge unguarded. Varys cast a quick look back toward the door where Ned and Sansa hid, then discreetly vanished into a side passage. Ned's heart pounded with relief. He led Sansa out onto the drawbridge, crossing it swiftly. Beyond lay the corridor he'd used earlier to enter the Holdfast. They retraced their route with minimal trouble, passing no one else until they reached the large hall that opened onto the outer ward. Servants bustled about, but none paid attention to a hooded girl and a stooped man. As they approached the yard, the din of the feast poured in from the direction of the throne room. Music, laughter, raised voices. Perfect cover for an escape. Ned guided Sansa toward a lesser-used postern door in the outer ward. Along the way, they passed groups of onlookers, a handful of off-duty guards gossiping, even a few well-dressed courtiers heading toward the main hall. Sansa kept her head bowed, face hidden in the hood. Ned feigned a limp, nodding politely if anyone glanced their way. No one gave them more than a passing glance. At last, they reached the postern gate behind the royal stables, the very gate Varys's key was meant for. 2 gold cloaks stood by it, though one seemed to be missing. Ned's stomach twisted. He had hoped it would be completely unguarded. The men were in hushed conversation, likely bored. Standing with Sansa just out of sight, Ned leaned close to her ear and whispered, "Wait here. If something goes wrong, run back inside and hide until you can find another chance. Promise me." Terror flitted across her features, but she nodded. "I promise." Ned stepped around the corner, adopting the same obsequious manner from before. "Begging your pardon, sirs," he said timidly to the gold cloaks. My master sent me to retrieve a lost trunk that fell off a cart near the water. I must pass." One guard scowled. "No one passes here without orders from the watch commander." The other guard gave a bored shrug. "The feast is on. Let him look if he must. We have bigger worries than some trunk." The scowling guard shifted. "We're to keep it locked, that's the order." But Captain Hurley said we could open it for supply runs if needed. The boy here is harmless." The second guard turned to Ned. "Go on. Get your trunk quick." Ned bowed gratefully, producing the small iron key. He tried to hide his trembling as he slid it into the lock. The guard frowned. "Where'd you get that?" "From the steward," Ned lied, trying to sound casual. "He said it's the only spare." He opened the gate a crack, stepping outside. The scowling guard muttered something suspicious, but the other held him back. "It's just a trunk, Trant. Let it be." In that moment, Ned half-turned. "Oh, I may need help carrying it," he ventured, trying to lure them away, but the scowler just sneered. "I'm no donkey," he said. "Fetch it yourself." Feigning disappointment, Ned edged out. The moment he was clear, he signaled Sansa with a quick wave. She darted forward, hood low. One guard glimpsed her. "Who's that?" he demanded sharply, starting to step after her. Ned acted without hesitation. He spun, seizing the guard's outstretched wrist, and drove a knee into the man's abdomen. A fierce jolt of pain shot up Ned's leg, but the guard doubled over with a grunt. The other guard fumbled for his spear. Sansa gasped. Ned threw his weight into slamming the door shut from the outside, forcing it against the spear shaft. The second guard cursed, trapped for a moment. "Run!" Ned barked at Sansa. She stumbled forward, and he dashed after her, hearing the guard behind them wrestling with the door. In seconds, they were sprinting across a narrow yard that ended in a steep stone staircase descending to the Blackwater Rush. The river smell hit them, briny and pungent. He heard shouts from behind. The gate had been reflung open. Footsteps pounded. They reached the top of the staircase, where a wooden walkway led down to a small boat moored at a rickety dock. A single figure stood there, waving them on, perhaps arranged by Varys. Ned realized with a surge of hope. "Go!" he urged Sansa, practically pushing her down the steps. She clutched at the railing, nearly stumbling. The guard's shouts drew closer. Ned risked a GLA. "NC back." Two gold cloaks were already on the upper steps, spears leveled. He turned, yanking a small ceramic sphere from his pouch. One of the poisons the House of Black and White had taught him to deploy, though usually meant for more subtle kills. He threw it at the guard's feet. It shattered, releasing a bitter, stinging cloud. The guards reeled, sputtering. One fell to his knees, retching. Ned heard more footsteps behind them. Reinforcements might be coming. He had only seconds to spare. He dashed after Sansa, who had reached the skiff. The waiting man, swarthy and hooded, beckoned them aboard. Ned recognized him by silhouette as one of Varys's silent agents. No time to question. He helped Sansa into the boat, then jumped in himself. The man cut the rope and pushed off with an oar. They drifted into the current as the guards stumbled to the dock, coughing and cursing. One tried to throw a spear, but it splashed harmlessly in the water. Sansa clung to Ned, breath ragged. The boatman rowed with swift, practiced strokes, guiding them downstream along the edge of the Blackwater. The Red Keep's walls receded behind them, shouts echoing faintly. Ned's heart pounded, adrenaline coursing. They had done it somehow, they had actually done it. Sansa trembled in his arms, half laughing, half crying in sheer relief. He stroked her hair. "It's all right," he whispered. "We're free of that place." "They'll come after us," she murmured, face pale. "They'll send men, oh father." He gently cupped her chin. "Hush. We'll be gone before they can catch our trail. We head downriver. With luck, we can find a ship to sail us north or east. They won't expect us to linger in the Crownlands." Varys promised a route. Sansa nodded, though her eyes brimmed with tears. I was sure I'd never see you again. All this time, I prayed, but I thought the gods had forsaken me. Now you're here, like a dream. Ned kissed her brow, voice choked with emotion. The gods are not done with us yet. The boatman guided them past looming pillars of a half-constructed bridge, through drifting detritus in the water. Fishermen on the banks might have glanced their way, but none shouted or pointed. In the sky overhead, gulls wheeled, giving shrill cries. Slowly the city's silhouette began to shrink behind them. Ned risked a final look back at the Red Keep, perched on its rocky promontory. Once that had been the seat of his downfall. Now he had slipped its grasp and taken Sansa from the heart of the lion's den. As they reached a bend in the river, the boatman guided the skiff toward a larger, flat-bottomed barge moored beneath a drooping willow on the south bank. A second man stood there, waving. Ned recognized a Braavosi style of cloak. Perhaps more of Varys's arrangements. They helped Sansa aboard the barge, and Ned followed. The boatman hopped out, spoke a few low words in a tongue Ned didn't recognize, maybe Lycene or Braavosi. Then the two men shoved the skiff away. It drifted aimlessly downriver. Anyone who found it might assume its occupants had fled further downstream. Ned took Sansa's hand. The men on the barge offered them a corner under a makeshift canopy. One of them rummaged in a crate and handed Sansa a small loaf of bread and a water flask. She thanked him quietly, still shaken. Ned realized she must be starving, who knew if she'd eaten that morning or if fear had taken her appetite. He let her eat, though his own hunger was overshadowed by the tension in his belly. The Braavosi man bowed slightly to Ned, speaking in rough common tongue. We will sail to open sea come nightfall. Small cost, courtesy of mutual friend. Then you can choose where to go. Pentos, Bravos, or anywhere beyond Lannister reach. Ned's relief mingled with a pang of realization. Once they reached open waters, the question remained which direction to flee. North was at war. If he sailed for White Harbor or Moat Cailin, they risked encountering Lannister or even Ironborn ships. The war had brought chaos to all corners. Bravos might be safest, ironically. He had spent much time there in the House of Black and White. But would Sansa be truly safe in Bravos? She spoke only the common tongue, had no friends there except, well, the dreaded Faceless men. That was no place for her to live in peace. Yet the thought of returning to Bravos stirred conflicting feelings. The House of Black and White considered him a rogue. Still, Bravos was vast. With enough coin and caution, they could hide. Or perhaps they could move on to Pentos or further to Volantis. At least across the narrow sea, the Lannisters' reach was weaker. Sansa swallowed a bite of bread, glancing at him anxiously. Father, we must let Mother know we're alive. And Arya, if she's still, do you know where she is? Ned's throat tightened. Arya escaped the day they took me, or so I've been told. I believe Yoren of the Night's Watch took her north. If that's true, she's well away from King's Landing. He squeezed Sansa's hand. We'll find a way to send word to your mother. She's with your brother Robb, I imagine, fighting against the Lannisters. But for now, we must vanish. If we rejoin Robb openly, we risk the Lannisters capturing you again. She nodded, still pale. I understand. Night came, and the barge drifted downstream, carried by the current. The men carefully maneuvered it past shallows and snags. At times, Ned glimpsed torchlight along the banks, patrols, or villages. Once, a cluster of men on horseback halted near the water, shining lanterns, but the barge stayed in the dark shadows under overhanging trees. The riders never noticed them. Far in the distance, the Red Keep's lights gradually faded to an orange glow. No sign of pursuit by boat. The city behind them, they pressed onward. By dawn of the next day, they reached the delta where the Blackwater opened into Blackwater Bay. The water widened and the barge began to pitch in the mild surf. Sansa stood by the rail, gazing at the horizon. Her cloak fluttered in a breeze that smelled of salt and freedom. Ned joined her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. If you prefer to attempt White Harbor or Deepwood Motte, we can try. But it's risky. The war covers half the north. Sansa looked out, eyes reflecting the pinkish hue of dawn. I'm not sure. Everything is so confusing. I only know I never want to see King's Landing again. Ned nodded solemnly. We'll decide soon. This vessel can't carry us far, but we'll meet a ship that can. The Braavosi man approached, pointing seaward. Another ship was faintly visible, sails furled, drifting near a rocky outcrop. He awaits, the man said, offering Ned a conspiratorial wink. Ned guessed it was some contact Varys had arranged or purchased, possibly a smuggler. Regardless, it was their ticket away from the Lannisters. They transferred from the barge to a smaller skiff that brought them out to the waiting ship. Sansa clutched Ned's arm, anxious about the unsteady water, but he supported her. The vessel was a two-masted galley, not large but sturdy, sporting no obvious banners. Its crew were a mix of Associ men with weathered faces, all business and few words. The captain, a tall man with a scar on his cheek, greeted them briefly. Ned handed over what coin he had left, along with a ring that bore a modest gemstone. It was all he could spare. The captain studied it and nodded curtly. No one asked for names. No one asked for reason. Smugglers rarely did. Within the hour, the galley's sails caught a breeze, and they headed east across the bay, the coastline shrinking behind them. Sansa stood at the rail, hair whipping in the briny wind, her expression a mixture of awe and lingering fear. Ned felt the tension in her posture. She had spent so many months in captivity that the open sea must feel unreal. He slipped an arm around her shoulders. "We're safe for now. They won't find us out here." She leaned into him. "Father, thank you," she whispered. Then, quietly, her tone darkened. "They killed so many. Septa Mordain, your men. I feel awful that I ever wanted to be Joffrey's queen. I was foolish." He kissed the top of her head. "You were a child raised on songs of gallant knights and chivalrous princes. The Lannisters deceived us all. Don't blame yourself." Tears welled in her eyes, but she swallowed them. "I just want to go home." Ned rubbed her arm gently. "We will find a home. If not Winterfell, then somewhere safer until this war ends." He forced hope into his voice, though part of him knew Winterfell might no longer be safe, given the rumors of conflict in the north, the Ironborn under Balon Greyjoy taking advantage of chaos. Every day brought new threats. For now, the best path lay across the narrow sea. As the galley traversed open waters, Sansa found a cramped cabin to rest in. She was exhausted, emotionally spent, so Ned let her sleep. He remained on deck, gazing westward at the watery horizon, lost in thought. They had escaped King's Landing. But what of the vengeance he swore for all the Lannisters had done? He remembered the oath he made to himself, the training he endured with the Faceless men. He could not undo that. It was part of him now. He turned over a small vial in his hand, the remains of the poison he had used to thwart the guards. A black droplet sloshed inside, lethal as a viper's fang. Part of him yearned to return in secrecy and finish the job, to put a blade in Joffrey's heart, to watch Cersei gasp her last breath. But he could not risk Sansa again, not while the realm remained in flames. His priority had been her safety, and he had achieved that, for now. Still, he had come so close to that final stroke, close enough to taste the blood of retribution. The notion that Joffrey remained on the throne stirred a dark rage in his gut. Let the boy king stay there a while longer, he told himself. Every vile act only turned more of the realm against the Lannisters. Sooner or later, that dynasty would collapse, and he might yet have a hand in it, from the shadows. The many-faced god was patient. Death always came in the end. The voyage east proved uneventful for the next several days. Wind and weather were mild, though the crew kept wary eyes on the northern horizon, muttering about the approach of autumn storms. Sansa stayed mostly in the cabin or near Ned, reluctant to interact with the rough sailors. At night, she often startled awake from nightmares, whispering of Joffrey's taunts, or the heads on pikes near the Red Keep. Ned would hold her hand until she settled. He wondered if the nightmares would haunt her forever. Eventually, they spotted the distant silhouette of the coast of Essos. The captain conferred with Ned, gesturing at a sea chart. "Pentos is here, Bravo's far north." He recommended disembarking near Pentos, as the city offered the easiest route for travelers fleeing Westeros. Bravo's was safer in some respects, but the route was longer, and storms brewed in that direction. Ned weighed the options. Bravo's was where he had once learned the ways of the Faceless men, but also where he might risk crossing their path again. Pentos, on the other hand, was ruled by magisters who often had dealings with the Targaryen exiles, and with the Lannisters. It was not entirely without danger, but might be more discreet. Sansa, overhearing, asked, "Which is safer, father?" "Neither is truly safe," he admitted. "Pentos might offer us a quieter life, if we keep our identities hidden. Bravos, I have experience there, but also some enemies. He hesitated, remembering the vow he swore to the House of Black and White. For your sake, Sansa, Pentos might be gentler. We can avoid court intrigues, perhaps. She nodded uncertainly. I trust your judgment. That settled it. Ned told the captain to head for Pentos. The man agreed, naming a docking fee that took much of what remained of Ned's coin. Ned gave him a curt nod. At least they would have a place to land that was not openly hostile. The days passed in a blur of wind and sun. Sansa's color improved a bit as the sea air gave her a faint flush in her cheeks. Ned tried to keep her spirits up, telling her small, fond memories of Winterfell, how Arya once tried to catch pigeons in the courtyard, or how Bran's laughter used to echo off the walls. She smiled, but sadness lingered in her eyes, a heartbreak that only time might mend. At last, the silhouette of Pentos's grand sprawl rose from the haze, the city's domes and spires gleaming in the midday sun. The galley navigated the lagoon, passing other merchant ships from Myr, Lys, and further afield. Pentos had a massive breakwater protecting the harbor. Ned stood by the prow with Sansa, glimpsing the opulent manses lining the waterfront, the flags of foreign princes fluttering in the breeze. Over it all loomed the sight of tall city walls built of pinkish stone. They docked at a busy wharf thronged with porters and hawkers. The captain accepted Ned's final coins and offered a perfunctory farewell. No love lost there, just business. Ned took Sansa's hand, leading her onto solid ground. The city's heat and bustle enveloped them immediately. Music, shouts, animal brays. Sansa blinked rapidly, taking it in. It's so different from King's Landing, she murmured. Stay close, Ned advised. He had heard that Pentos, for all its splendor, was rife with thieves and slavers if one ventured into the wrong quarter. They needed to find a place to rest, some modest inn near the harbor or in a quieter district, out of sight from powerful magisters who might have ties to the Lannisters. The last thing they needed was for word to reach Westeros that Eddard Stark was alive in Pentos. Ned guided Sansa through the throng, staying alert for pickpockets. Despite her plain cloak, her refined features marked her as highborn. More than once, unscrupulous eyes lingered on them. He made a show of keeping his hand near his hidden dagger, discouraging trouble. They found a quiet side street where the odors of fish and rotting produce subsided somewhat. Eventually, Ned spotted a small inn with a sign showing a painted starfish. The building looked worn but not disreputable. Inside, a plump Pentoshi innkeeper greeted them with a certain wariness. Ned rented a single room. He had just enough left in the smaller coin he'd managed to keep hidden in a belt pouch. The innkeeper eyed Sansa but said nothing. Once behind the sturdy door of the room, Ned finally exhaled. It contained a single bed, a small table, and a flickering lamp. Better than the cramped spaces on the ship. Sansa sank onto the bed, letting out a shaky sigh. We're really here, she said softly. I never thought. He knelt beside her, taking her hands. We'll need to be cautious. Use false names, keep to ourselves. Let no one suspect who we are. The Lannisters might have agents here. She nodded. Of course. Then she met his gaze, hesitating. Father, about everything. The way you looked, the way you fought. You're different now. Where were you all this time? Ned swallowed. He did not want to reveal the entire truth, not yet. The House of Black and White, the training, the murders he had done, it would horrify her. I was taken east, he lied carefully. I escaped. I learned a few new skills from those who aided me. Sansa, I'm sorry for leaving you in King's Landing for so long. Tears glistened in her eyes. I know you must have had no choice. I'm so grateful you came back for me. She leaned forward, hugging him. He held her, feeling the warmth of her tears on his neck. That night, they dined on simple fare the innkeeper provided, a stew of fish and beans, somewhat bland but filling. Ned felt a stirring of relief to see Sansa eat more than she had in days. Afterward, he stepped outside into the courtyard to gather his thoughts. Stars glittered above, the night air cooler than the day's swelter. The city's hum drifted over the walls and the smell of spice mingled with sea brine. He needed to think about the future. They could not stay in this inn indefinitely, not without coin. And forging new identities in Pentos might require silver for bribes and documents. He might find mercenary work or something menial, but that risked exposure. He considered contacting Illyrio Mopatis, the wealthy magister rumored to have aided the Targaryens. But that name triggered caution. Illyrio was as cunning as Varys. No telling how he might use Ned and Sansa as pawns. Perhaps they could quietly slip to a smaller trading town along the coast where no one cared about Westerosi politics. They might live as farmers or fishers, remain anonymous until the war ended. The idea pained Ned's pride. He was a Stark of Winterfell, and that was his rightful seat, his children's birthright. But the safety of Sansa mattered more than pride. He closed his eyes, recalling Robb's face, Arya's fierce grin, Bran's curiosity. He wanted to see them again, but traveling north was too dangerous. It would have to wait until the realm found peace, if that day ever came. Meanwhile, winter crept closer, and the realm was consumed by war. Returning to the room, he found Sansa asleep on the bed, her breathing soft, exhaustion claiming her at last. Ned sat in the lone chair, half-dozing. Dreams flickered behind his eyes, memories of the crypts at Winterfell, of Catelyn's voice calling his name, of 1,000 regrets. Then came images of the House of Black and White, the kindly-faced man, the ebony-eyed woman, the chanting of the many-faced god. He twitched awake with a gasp, heart racing. Morning dawned with bright sunlight spilling through the crooked shutters. Ned roused Sansa gently. They broke their fast on bread and weak ale. He told her they must wander the city to learn its ways, find the cost of living, search for a possible trade or skill he could use. She agreed. They donned simple garb, leaving behind anything that marked them as Westerosi nobility. Pentos's streets in daylight were a riot of color and noise, with vendors hawking spiced meats, fruits, and dyed fabrics. Sansa gaped at the tall domes and colorful mosaics depicting dragons and ancient gods. The architecture contrasted sharply with the sooty stone of King's Landing. Children darted through the crowds, and women wore loose gowns with bright sashes. Men strolled in sandals and embroidered vests. They soon discovered that Pentoshi coin was required for much of anything, and Ned had little left. He had to think quickly. They visited a few dockside establishments where foreign sellswords congregated. Ned quietly asked about local opportunities, ignoring side glances at Sansa. The men spoke of magisters who might pay well for discreet tasks. Some whispered of smuggling or other shady ventures. Ned found it distasteful, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. He left each place with more questions than answers. Sansa, meanwhile, trailed behind him, wary of the leering stares she sometimes received. At midday, they found a small courtyard with a public fountain. Ned bought her a small honey pastry with his last Pentoshi copper. She smiled sadly, chewing slowly. "I wish Arya and Bran could taste this," she said softly. "They'd love it. It's sweet like summer." He squeezed her hand. "One day, we'll all share such treats together." They resumed exploring. On a hunch, Ned visited a certain quarter near the east wall where foreign smiths and craftsmen plied their trades. Perhaps he could pass himself off as a hired guard or a stable hand. Despite being a great swordsman once, he had to hide that skill. A sword arm as well trained as his might raised suspicions. But with a bit of feigned mediocrity he could manage. While Ned was inquiring with a Tyroshi blacksmith, Sansa loitered outside, near a mosaic-tiled walkway. Suddenly, Ned heard her shriek. He whirled around, heart jolting. A ragged man had seized her wrist, a knife in hand. Sansa struggled, eyes wide with terror. Ned acted on instinct. He lunged forward, seizing the man's arm, twisting it until the bones cracked. The man yowled, dropping the knife. Ned slammed his head into the doorframe, rendering him limp. Sansa staggered back, shaking. He grabbed me, tried to say something about a ransom. She clutched her cloak tight, breath ragged. A few onlookers gawked. Ned glowered at them, brandishing the fallen knife. They backed away. The Tyroshi blacksmith poked his head out, cursing in his own tongue, then shrugged and went back inside. Pentos had no time for minor squabbles. Ned tugged Sansa away. The man groaned, half-conscious on the ground, but Ned did not linger. They fled down an alley. When they paused to catch breath, Ned saw tears welling in Sansa's eyes. "They're after us, I know it. Someone recognized me. They'll sell me to the Lannisters." He held her close. "Hush. It might just have been a thief or a vile man seeing an unprotected girl. We can't be sure, but we cannot remain in these streets." That evening, they returned to the inn and locked themselves in. Ned paced restlessly, mind churning. This city was not safe for them. He realized with grim certainty that he was repeating his earlier mistake in King's Landing, assuming they could hide in plain sight. Better to vanish entirely, perhaps. As the lamplight flickered, Sansa perched on the bed, eyes downcast. "What do we do, father?" Ned let out a weary sigh. "We can't remain here. We should seek passage to Bravos. I know some of its ways. We can hide more easily there." The faceless men, he paused, searching for words that would not alarm her. "They won't trouble us unless I break my vow to them. We'll keep low. Find honest work if we can, a place to live quietly." Sansa nodded slowly. "I'll follow wherever you go." The next morning, Ned gathered their sparse belongings, intending to check the harbor for a ship to Bravos. Before they left the inn, though, the innkeeper blocked his path, demanding more payment. Ned confessed he was nearly out of coin. The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. Then you must find it or you'll be out on the street. I understand, Ned said. We'll leave now. The innkeeper harumphed but allowed them to depart, no doubt relieved to see the last of 2 guests who could not pay. Ned and Sansa left with the clothes on their backs, a waterskin, and little else. Down at the docks, they found a half-dozen ships moored. One was set to sail for Lys, another for Volantis, and another for Bravos, though the fare demanded was higher than Ned possessed. He tried to bargain, but the Bravosi captain, a woman with a scarred lip, refused to budge. I'm no charity, she snapped. Pay or find another boat. Dejected, they paced the wharf. Sansa's shoulders drooped in fatigue. A chance collision with a passing porter nearly knocked her to the ground. Ned steadied her. We'll find some way, he vowed, though he felt desperation knotting his gut. Then, like a specter from a half-forgotten dream, a man in fine robes approached them, flanked by 2 armed guards. He was plump, with an oiled beard and rings on every finger. Ned recognized him from descriptions, Magister Illyrio Mopatus. He'd never met the man face to face, but Varys had once mentioned Illyrio in passing, praising his cunning. Illyrio smiled broadly. My dear travelers, you look as though you've lost your way. Might I be of assistance? His voice was rich, almost fatherly, but Ned sensed the calculating mind beneath. He forced a courteous bow. My daughter and I seek passage to Bravos, but we lack the silver to pay a captain's demands. Illyrio nodded sympathetically. Ah, Bravos? A splendid city, though not always welcoming. Perhaps I can help. I have ships. I have many things. If you would but share a moment of your time at my modest manse, perhaps we can come to an arrangement. His gaze lingered on Sansa, who lowered her head, uneasy. Ned felt alarm bells ring. Illyrio's generosity was rarely without a price. Yet with no coin, no allies, and the city proving treacherous, he might have no choice. If Illyrio guessed their true identities, that might be even more dangerous, or it might be precisely why he offered help. The Magister was known to have aided Targaryen claimants in the past. Perhaps he would relish having Ned Stark in his debt. But what alternative did Ned have? As Sansa trembled beside him, he saw no immediate solution. Illyrio's guards stood casually, but Ned knew they could subdue him if he refused or tried to flee. At length, he nodded stiffly. We accept your invitation, my lord. Excellent. Illyrio beamed, clapping his hands. My litter awaits. This way, if you please. He led them along the quay to where a gilded litter with silken curtains stood. The guards opened it for Sansa and Ned. Illyrio climbed in after them, his bulk nearly filling the seat. The litter-bearers, for strong men, hoisted it onto their shoulders and carried them off through Pentosa's bustling streets. Sansa clung to Ned's arm, tension radiating from her. Illyrio offered them sweet wine from a silver flask, which Ned politely declined. He did not wish to be drugged or lulled. The Magister sipped, licking his lips. So, you wish to go to Bravos? May I ask why? Family there, or business? Ned forced a flat smile. We're refugees from Westeros, seeking a quieter life, he said vaguely. Ah, Westeros. A troubled land these days. Illyrio's eyes twinkled with curiosity. So many wars. The Lannisters, the Starks, the Baratheons, but you must know this. A pity about poor Eddard Stark, they say he was executed. TSK. Tragic. He eyed Ned intently as he spoke. Ned's pulse hammered, but he kept his composure, mouth drawn in a thin line. Yes, a tragedy was all he said. Indeed. Illyrio sipped more wine. I have dealings with the Westerosi from time to time. One must keep abreast of events. Should you ever need an introduction or a letter of passage, I can provide it for a modest fee, of course. They traveled in tense silence after that, the city's domes and arches passing by until they reached Illyrio's manse, a grand estate with marble columns, walled gardens, and exotic statues. Servants bowed them through a wide foyer, the floors covered in mosaic tiles depicting hunting scenes. Sansa stared at the lavish surroundings, overwhelmed. Ned kept his guard up, scanning for exits. Illyrio brought them to a shaded courtyard where a fountain trickled into a wide pool filled with silvery fish. Cushions were arranged around a low table laden with fresh fruit, meats, and wines. Please refresh yourselves, Illyrio said. No sense discussing business on an empty stomach. Sansa looked at Ned uncertainly. He nodded and they each took a seat on the cushions. The servants offered them plates. Ned sampled a fig, finding it ripe and sweet. Sansa nibbled at bread, anxious. Illyrio reclined with a plateful of spiced duck, devouring it greedily between words. When the initial courtesies were done, Illyrio dabbed his greasy fingers on a silk napkin. Now, about your journey to Bravos. I can secure you passage easily. I have a merchant galley leaving next week. You and your daughter could sail in comfort. No cost to you. Ned narrowed his eyes. What do you want in return? Illyrio chuckled. Straight to the point. Very well. My business associates are always in need of credible men to handle certain tasks. Should you arrive in Bravos, there might be a small favor required of you, perhaps delivering a message to a colleague of mine, ensuring it reaches the right hands without prying eyes. A trifling matter. In exchange, you sail for free. That's all. Ned didn't trust the casual tone. What manner of message? Just a letter of introduction, nothing harmful, Illyrio said breezily. But it must be delivered discreetly. The Bravosi banking houses are competitive. My friend needs to establish certain lines of credit without interference from rivals. If you accept, your passage is guaranteed. Sansa glanced at Ned, uncertain. Ned drummed his fingers on the cushion, suspecting any letter from Illyrio might hold hidden codes or alliances. But he saw no other path forward if they wished to reach Bravos. The alternative was to remain in Pentos, vulnerable. He exhaled. Very well, I'll deliver your letter. On the condition that no harm befalls us if we fail to do so. My daughter's safety remains paramount. Illyrio gave a theatrical wave. Of course, of course. I am a man of generosity, as you see. You shall have the letter sealed. No one else need know of it. My galley will depart in 6 days. In the meantime, consider yourselves guests in my manse. Rest, eat, enjoy the baths. Your daughter looks weary. Sansa blushed, dipping her gaze. Ned met Illyrio's eyes. I appreciate your hospitality, but we must keep a low profile. Oh, I can be quite discreet, Illyrio said with a knowing smirk. You'll remain unseen by my other guests, if that is your wish. My servants know the value of silence. Relax, dear travelers. The city can be cruel, but here you are safe. Ned felt no ease in the Magister's velvet assurances. Yet the immediate danger of the streets was relieved and they would gain passage to Bravos. He murmured thanks. Illyrio clapped his hands, summoning a servant girl who led Ned and Sansa to separate chambers in the eastern wing. The rooms were lavish by any standard, with plush mattresses and scented candles. Despite his misgivings, Ned had to admit it was far better than the inn. Sansa seemed almost frightened by the luxury, as if any moment it might be snatched away. Ned assured her softly, I'll be next door. Bolt your door from the inside. If anything troubles you, call out. She nodded, still unsettled. Father, what if this man is leading us into a trap? Ned forced a reassuring smile. We'll remain vigilant. I promise I won't let anyone hurt you. This arrangement is temporary. We'll sail soon. She took a breath, clearly trying to trust him. All right? Ned closed her door gently, then entered his own chamber. He paced, scanning for hidden passages, eavesdropping holes, or signs of watchers. He found none, though that hardly meant there weren't any. These walls might have ears. Eventually, he sat on the bed, tension knotting his shoulders. They had survived King's Landing only to risk entanglement with Illyrio Mopatis. The Game of Thrones reached even across the sea, it seemed. Still, if it brought them to Bravos, they might truly disappear there, adopting new identities in that city of canals and shadows. Ned felt a flicker of dread at the thought of encountering the House of Black and White again. He was a rogue in their eyes, yet he had not betrayed their secrets. He prayed that was enough to keep them off his trail. 6 days to kill until the ship sailed. He resolved to keep out of sight, avoid letting slip any clue that might reveal his name. Better to let Illyrio guess than confirm the truth. He would deliver this mysterious letter, then vanish into Bravos with Sansa. That was the plan. But plans in Essos, like in Westeros, often went astray when powerful men saw an advantage. With a quiet sigh, Ned lay back on the soft bed, letting the weight of uncertainty press upon him. He closed his eyes, remembering the darkest lessons from the Faceless men, only death can pay for life. He wondered if that debt might yet come due for him. For Sansa, he would risk any price. He drifted into uneasy sleep. A dream came, the face of Joffrey, sneering, morphing into the kindly-faced man, then dissolving into the Titan of Bravos. A swirl of shapes of open waters and shifting silhouettes. When Ned awoke, the candles had burned low. Night enveloped the manse. Beyond the window, he heard distant music, laughter, and the ever-present hum of Pentos at night. He sat up, exhaling softly, a vow forming again in his chest. He would protect Sansa at all costs, see her safe in Bravos. And one day, if the gods were merciful, he would find a chance to settle scores with the Lannisters, the false king, and all those who had torn his family asunder. He was no longer the straightforward man who had come to King's Landing as the king's hand, full of illusions of justice. He was a shadow now, shaped by the darkness of betrayal, sharpened by the Faceless men's arts. If war and chaos still raged across the narrow sea, eventually he might slip back to Westeros when the time was ripe. Then the lion would face the wolf once more, not in the open field, but in the hidden corners where nightmares took shape. For now, though, he cast those thoughts aside. Sansa's future was all that mattered. Tomorrow, they would see what Illyrio truly wanted and how he meant to gain it. Ned would play the game carefully, mindful of each step, each word. He had learned that in the House of Black and White, silent patience until the moment to strike or the moment to vanish. That was the only way forward in a world where trust was fragile and betrayal thrived like weeds in a graveyard. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, marking a late hour. Ned lay back on the cushions, imagining Winterfell's godwood, the hush of snow drifting between the ancient trees, a simpler time with his children's laughter echoing in the courtyard. A pang of longing seized him. He whispered a soft prayer to the old gods or perhaps the many-faced god. Then he forced himself into a light doze, preparing for the new dawn in Pentos and the uncertain bargains it would bring. Above all, he reminded himself, keep Sansa safe, keep hidden, and keep ready. For the shadows had become his only ally and the dance of fate was far from finished.